The story begins with a man wondering if this is truly how everything ends. He apologizes, admitting his weakness and believing Chris was the real hero. A woman corrects him, revealing that he is actually Evan, the hero himself. She reminds him that they all gave their best, and if Chris had learned swordsmanship a little earlier, he could have reached 9 stars and become a 10-star hero. If that had happened, perhaps they could have prevented the end. Evan is a jack of all trades and master of all, known as the great extra character. His journey began at 20, after escaping his clan and dreaming of achieving success. While working in the back alleys, he witnessed flying wyverns and the demon king of carnage invading the magic empire, marking the beginning of the Age of Destruction. Amid the chaos, Evan noticed a recruitment notice for a party traveling with the hero. Seeing it as his chance to gain wealth and honor, he joined them, but his hopes were crushed when they failed, and the Dominion of Light fell to the Demon King. Evan wishes he could turn back time and choose Chris as the hero. Chris questions what he means, saying that even if he could return to the past, he would never choose to experience such suffering again. One life of suffering is enough, especially with the world already on the verge of destruction. As they stare at the sky, Chris accepts that this is truly the end. He wonders if there might be another life and, if there is, wishes to be born into a wealthy, noble family. That becomes his final thought. Later, Chris looks down at his hands and realizes that his wish has somehow come true. He has regressed and been reborn as a young master of the magic empire, specifically within the Dark Magic clan, one of the 12 clans supporting the empire. From what he can gather, he has gone 15 years into the past, returning 5 years before the Age of Destruction begins. He thought he had already experienced everything in his previous life, yet he never expected to encounter demon beasts tending a garden. More importantly, he knows exactly whose body he has entered: Christian von Baron Kazar. Chris speaks with a foxwoman who tells him about the notorious fiend with the middle name Von. She explains that the house of Count Kazar is a branch family of Baron County, belonging to the Dark Magic clan. Although it is a branch family, it holds a respectable position within the clan and is extremely wealthy. Almost everyone in the Magic Empire knows the family, which has 2 potential successors. However, the eldest son, Christian, is a complete bastard who constantly causes trouble. Count Kazar eventually gave up on him, but that is already old news. When Chris asks whether he somehow changed his ways, she explains that he did not. Instead, he was eventually murdered by his own relatives. Chris immediately breaks into a sweat. All he wanted was to become the son of an ordinary wealthy family, yet he has somehow regressed into the body of a man destined to die. He wonders why he had to become this particular person and what he did to deserve it. He only awakened 3 days ago, yet he is supposed to die in 2 years. Since Christian was eliminated from the house of Count Kazar, a family that values honor above all else, Chris concludes that his former self must have been an exceptionally terrible person. Perhaps if he keeps his head down and behaves himself, he can avoid the same fate. Still, since he has been reborn as a rich kid, he considers simply enjoying the wealth and status. He quickly reminds himself that such a plan is impossible. Ragnarok, the end of the world, is also what drove the Demon King of Carnage to begin the war. Humanity was meant to be sacrificed to complete Ragnarok, and by the time they discovered the truth, it was already too late. Both the Dominion of Light and the world ultimately fell. If Chris wants to survive, he must stop the apocalypse as well. The Demon King of Carnage is only part of the problem. The greater threat is the countless fiends of the Magic Empire who remain loyal to him. To stop them, Chris needs to become more powerful than the Demon King himself. There is only one way to accomplish that. He must become the Demon Emperor and rise to the very top of the Magic Empire. With 5 years remaining before the Age of Destruction begins, he decides to give it a try. If he succeeds, the entire empire will eventually belong to him. Soon after, his father confronts him, slamming his hand against the table and demanding to know why he has left his room after the incident he caused. He warns Chris that if he acts out of line again, he will personally cut off his head. Chris finds Count Kazar intimidating but explains that he has come to apologize for everything he has done. If he wants to carry out his plan, he first needs to erase his terrible reputation. He kneels and sincerely apologizes for all his past actions, promising they will never happen again. His father remains skeptical, having heard countless excuses from him before. Chris admits that the loss of his father's trust is entirely his fault. He explains that 3 days ago, he also mentioned losing part of his memories. While trying to recover them, he reflected on his past actions and realized how badly he had been living. Chris acknowledges that words alone mean nothing and promises to prove his change through his actions. As the first step, he asks to be sent to the punishment cave for an entire month, where he intends to show his father a different version of himself. The punishment cave is a prison reserved for high-status fiends. It contains no light and completely blocks all 5 senses, making even a few days enough to wear down a person's mind. For Chris, however, it is ideal because it gives him a place to escape the attention of everyone around him. His father doubts that Chris can survive even half a day, let alone an entire month. Chris admits that he understands how difficult the cave is, but believes enduring it is the bare minimum needed to regain his father's trust. His father reminds him that they have had this same conversation countless times, only for Chris to disappoint him again. Still, he agrees to give him one final chance. If nothing changes after the month, Chris will be banished from the clan. Chris knows that exile would effectively be a death sentence because countless people would come after him once he loses the clan's protection. Even so, he accepts the condition. In return, if he proves that he is truly changed, he asks his father to grant him a request. His father finds his confidence irritating, as though Chris already expects to survive. Nevertheless, he agrees that if Chris genuinely turns over a new leaf, he will grant him any request, though he still doubts that will ever happen. Later, Chris's butler Cox enters his room and informs him that the punishment cave is ready. Cox is a half-vampire, and Chris acknowledges him before following him out. As they walk through the hallway, the maids and butlers whisper about Chris volunteering for the punishment cave. They suspect he is planning another scheme. They also recall the incident where he insulted the young lady of the poison magic clan, forcing Count Khazar himself to apologize and preserve the family's standing with their rival clan. They question when Chris will finally mature, though most doubt that he ever will. They even speculate about how long he will survive in the cave, with 2 days being considered the absolute maximum. Chris simply smiles as he continues down the hallway, while his younger brother secretly listens nearby. At the punishment cave, Cox announces that they have arrived. Chris looks toward one of the statues guarding the entrance and realizes that it is actually a Death Knight assigned to guard the cave. He finds such a guard fitting for the magic empire and does not care as long as it keeps others from entering. Just then, his younger brother calls out to him. Chris turns around and recognizes him as a familiar face. He is Christian's biological younger brother and a model student named Thurv von Baron Khazar. Without hesitation, Thurv draws his rapier and thrusts it directly toward Chris's throat, stopping just short of making contact. Chris does not even flinch. Chris looks down into his brother's eyes, internally admitting that the sudden attack scares the hell out of him. He asks Thorn what business he has with him since he clearly did not come to say goodbye. Thorn reminds him that he is already a disgrace to the family and warns that if Chris stains their honor again, he will kill him. He makes it clear that this is his final warning. Chris realizes that Thorn must be the one who killed him in his previous life. He had personally met him during the Age of Destruction, where Thorn became famous for his cursed magic. Chris remembers him as a talented fiend, and notes that despite looking rather cute as a child, he has trained diligently. Still, compared to someone who survived the worst of the Age of Destruction, Chris considers him nothing more than a brat. When Chris tells him to move the weapon, Thorn demands to know what he just said. Chris simply acknowledges his warning and tells him to leave. Thorn insists that he is serious, but Chris ignores him and enters the cave, leaving Thorn awkwardly standing outside. Thorn then turns on Cox, demanding to know what is wrong with Chris's attitude. Inside the cave, Chris walks forward and realizes that he cannot see or hear anything. Only the faintest sensation remains around his fingertips. He assumes this is intentional so prisoners can still feel the objects they bring inside and avoid starving to death. An ordinary person would quickly become mentally exhausted in such conditions, but Chris has experienced far worse during his time as a treasure hunter. In fact, losing his 5 senses is exactly what he wanted because it allows him to focus entirely on himself. Without this isolation, he cannot rebuild his damaged body. The process requires time and luck, but with the medical knowledge he mastered as the Divine Doctor, the bone compression art he modified from the circus, and magic stones with different properties, he believes it is possible. He never expected to obtain magic stones because of how expensive they are, so he considers this another privilege of belonging to an elite clan willing to fulfill even a request from someone considered useless. In his previous life, he and Evan had struggled to obtain such stones, even being forced to work in the mines for them. He begins with the white magic stone, which is used to purify toxins. It is a tedious but essential process that requires him to remove the accumulated toxins throughout his body, using white mana. Even the slightest mistake causes intense pain throughout his body. As he begins the purification, a tingling sensation spreads through him, similar to the pins and needles feeling from sitting too long. Instead of being bothered, Chris smiles and considers the process a piece of cake. Sometime later, Cox reports to Chris's father. When Count Khazar asks about his son, Cox explains that Chris has entered the cave and worries that the punishment may break him so badly that he will not even be able to call for help. His father begins questioning whether sending Chris there was a mistake. Chris had once shown so much promise as a child, and he wonders whether that talent made him arrogant enough to fall apart so completely. Whatever the reason, He would rather see Chris completely ruined or dead than continue living such a wretched life. His emotions remain conflicted between anger and sadness. Although Chris's recent words sounded reasonable, he refuses to place his hopes in him after being deceived so many times. He then asks Cox whether anything unusual happened. Cox admits that there was an incident and, after being ordered to explain everything, reveals that Chris took several magic stones into the cave, including a dreamstone capable of causing hallucinations. Since they do not know what side effects it may have, Cox believes they should immediately open the cave. Count Khazar's fist trembles with frustration, but he refuses. If Chris has done something that foolish, then he tells Cox to leave him there and let him die. A month later, Count Khazar stands before the punishment cave, assuming Chris must be completely broken by now. The door slowly opens, but instead of the ruined figure he expects, his father is stunned by the sight before him. Chris emerges with a bright, healthy appearance and tells his father that he has been waiting for him to finally arrive. He asks whether he is surprised and reminds him that he promised to return as a changed man. His father's eyes begin to tear up as he recognizes the same look Chris had possessed as a child. He realizes that Chris truly endured the punishment. Chris laughs and asks whether that counts as a compliment. His father immediately warns him not to get carried away over something so minor, reminding him that he still does not trust him. Chris accepts that he simply needs to work harder. His father assumes he barely survived the month, but Chris explains that he was too busy training to ever become bored. First, he rebuilt his body into the optimal condition for mastering swordsmanship. Thanks to the white monostone, every cell in his body is now filled with vitality. The Dreamstone also played a major role. Cox questions whether Chris really brought such a dangerous stone into the punishment cave, and Chris says he is glad he stubbornly insisted on keeping it. The hallucinations drastically reduced the time required for his metamorphosis, and he also managed to create 2 cores. Chris demonstrates his progress by casting the 1-star spell light. He uses his darkness core to conceal the light core, knowing that the fiends would make a huge fuss if they discovered it. His father, therefore, does not consider the feat particularly impressive. Chris then senses something and watches one of the stones fly toward him. Looking closer, he realizes the Dreamstone was deliberately given to him in hopes that it would make him hallucinate, break him mentally, and ruin him. Instead, he willingly accepted it and endured everything it brought, using it as the sacrifice necessary for his advancement. Since he has kept his promise, Chris reminds his father that he is now entitled to make a request. His father allows him to speak, and Chris asks to use the Black Swamp Knight's training ground. His father immediately objects, explaining that someone as useless as Chris has no place there. The Black Swamp Knights are one of the 3 knightly orders supporting the Dark Magic clan, and only the most elite knights are permitted to train there. Chris clarifies that he only wants to borrow the training ground. He believes observing the bravery and discipline of the Black Swamp Knights will be good for him, and he has no intention of joining their order. After considering it, his father agrees but warns him not to disgrace himself in front of the knights. Chris then reveals that he has one more request, surprising his father. At the training ground, the trainees immediately notice Chris arriving in expensive clothing. They openly badmouth him, and Chris understands that in the Magic Empire, strength matters more than status. Still, there is a specific reason he came here. His second request was access to the library. His father explains that Chris must first obtain Deputy Commander Melon's letter of recommendation. The library contains many of the House of Count Khazar's dark magic grimoires, and anyone wishing to study dark magic needs permission to access them. Chris understands but questions why he needs such a condition when he is already a member of the clan. His father reminds him that he apparently forgot how he once tried to sell advanced grimoires on the black market. Chris silently wonders what kind of life his previous self lived, and concludes that he truly was a worthless piece of work. Still, his immediate priority is gaining Deputy Commander Melon's recognition. He looks up and spots Thorn surrounded by several trainees. Thorn tells him that this is not a place someone like Chris is allowed to enter. Chris finds the situation troublesome but smiles, realizing it may actually be the perfect opportunity. Thorn repeats that this is his final warning, and tells Chris to return before he throws away the life he barely managed to preserve in the punishment cave. Chris asks whether Thorn can really say that when their father was the one who granted him permission to enter the training ground. Thorn is surprised, but another voice interrupts. A woman says that she respects the Count's orders, although she knows Chris is not very trustworthy. The woman is Melon, the deputy commander of the Knights. Judging from the dark energy surrounding her, she is at least a 4-star fiend. It is clear that she and the others intend to intimidate Chris into leaving, but he is already accustomed to threats like these. Chris bows and respectfully greets her, surprising Melon when she realizes he can withstand her dark energy. He explains that since the deputy commander herself has stepped in, there is no point arguing, and says he will prove that he is qualified to use the training ground. When Melon asks how he intends to prove it, Chris proposes fighting one of the fiends there and defeating them. Melon considers his claim ridiculous, but Chris insists that he is completely serious. He asks her not to use dark energy because, considering his former debauched lifestyle, his capacity for it is far below what it should be. Instead, he requests an unarmed duel. Melon considers the situation troublesome. Even if it is only a duel, she cannot allow one of her knights to get seriously injured. She asks whether Chris genuinely believes he can compete in an unarmed fight. Chris leaves the answer to the fight itself and starts considering who would make a suitable opponent. He then snaps his fingers, deciding that one of the trainees should be enough. The chosen opponent immediately becomes irritated, while Melon tells Chris to select someone more suitable because the trainees he has chosen are only 2-star fiends. Chris explains that reaching 2 stars is already an achievement that an ordinary 13-year-old cannot accomplish without exceptional talent. Age does not matter. Without the necessary ability, even someone 23 would struggle to reach that level. But Chris is no ordinary bastard. Since he needs to prove himself anyway, he decides that fighting someone stronger would be more effective. He challenges the trainees to send someone stronger and asks whether they are really afraid of fighting his brother. The trainees, clearly irritated, accept the duel. They surround the fighters and encourage their chosen opponent to destroy Chris, warning that failure will earn him special training. Chris asks Melon how they will determine the winner and whether they will simply fight until one side surrenders. Melon considers his question insolent and says the duel will continue until one side is incapacitated. She even thinks it would be appropriate if the trainees took one or both of his legs. Chris makes sure everyone heard the rules and remarks that his opponent is in for a serious beating. The taunts infuriate the trainee, who vows to make Chris regret running his mouth. While the opponent is distracted, Chris suddenly smashes him across the face, catching everyone off guard. He points out that the fight has already started. The trainee swings at him and tells him to shut up, but Chris explains that the situation is almost unfair. A fiend who has not even reached 1 star has little chance against someone capable of using dark energy. However, this is a bare-handed duel, and Chris has fought on countless battlefields in his previous life. He drives his knee into the opponent's stomach and adds that if only the dominion of light's power he developed inside the punishment cave is considered, he is already at least a 3-star. The surrounding trainees stare in disbelief as their opponent doubles over, clutching his stomach. Chris continues provoking him, asking whether he is crying and joking that he could blow on his injury if it hurts that badly. Thorn demands to know what trick Chris used, but Chris is simply pleased to see his brother in such a state. He insists that there was no trick and that Thorn is simply too weak. Thorn grows angrier, but Chris keeps provoking him, pretending that he cannot hear him because he is being so quiet. A black aura suddenly envelops Thorn's hand as he charges forward, declaring that he will kill Chris. He throws a left punch, but Chris easily dodges it and acknowledges that Thorn is fast, saying this is the spirit he was looking for. Thorn continues throwing punches at his face, but Chris keeps avoiding them and concludes that it still is not enough. Chris raises his hand and cuts off the dark energy flowing through the rest of Thorn's body. Thorn immediately notices his dark energy beginning to dissipate. Chris then lands an uppercut, explaining that fighting ultimately comes down to instinct. Thorn's eyes turn white as he collapses to the ground. The other trainees are stunned. They wonder whether they had underestimated Chris and suggest that Thorn may have deliberately weakened his dark energy because he was afraid of hurting him. Otherwise, none of this makes sense. Melon, however, understands what happened and is genuinely surprised. Chris calmly asks whether he has now proven that he is qualified to use the training ground. Melon confirms that he has. Chris thanks her and maintains a composed expression, but internally he is relieved that his plan worked. Now he can begin devouring everything available to him, whether it involves swordsmanship or magic. Back at the house of Count Khazar, Chris explains that he has reached 1 star in dark magic. Since he is still not accustomed to handling dark energy and much of Christian's residue remains in his body, the process took longer than expected. As for simultaneously wielding light and dark power, he will need to raise his level further before that becomes possible. Chris rings a small bell, and a woman slowly appears in his room, asking whether he called for her. She is Mary, his maid. Chris cannot believe that the clan uses a high-level evil spirit, a banshee, as a maid. He admits that Christian's constant troublemaking must have been the reason for such an arrangement, and decides that he will eventually replace her. For now, he asks her to bring him some juice, so he can drink it before leaving for training. Mary asks whether she should prepare it with human blood, but Chris tells her to make it with strawberries instead. She insists that blood juice tastes much better, but Chris remains firm about wanting strawberries. They continue their brief exchange before Chris eventually prepares to leave. As he heads out, Cox calls after him and asks whether he is really going to train so early. He worries that Chris may be pushing himself too hard, but is also pleased and proud to see him working so diligently, especially since he believed in him when everyone else did not. Chris immediately releases some killing intent and tells Cox to stop acting as though his belief matters. He never asked Cox to believe in him and questions who gave him the right to decide whether Chris deserved that belief. Cox is startled and quickly apologizes for overstepping his boundaries before wishing Chris a good training session. After Cox leaves, Chris becomes suspicious. Something about the man at the training grounds feels strange. He notices that everyone there seems far more relaxed than before, and now that their guard is down, he plans to gradually win them over. Nearby, a bird-like man watches Chris practicing with his sword before returning to a tent to inform Deputy Commander Melon that Chris has come back to the training grounds. Melon wonders what Chris is planning and recalls their previous duel. His movements had been impressive, especially the precise moment when he dispelled his dark energy. She wonders whether he had actually read the battle correctly. If that is true, he may possess enough talent to surpass Lord Escade de Baron, the direct head of the main family. However, she dismisses the possibility, reminding herself that Chris is still only a bastard whose dark energy was already ruined by his previous lifestyle. She believes there is no way he can close that gap now. A commotion outside catches her attention, so she goes to investigate. One of the men explains that Chris has had a small conflict with a squire. The trainees begin wondering what happened. Since Cannon is a one-star fiend, they speculate that Chris may have reached 1 star as well. Melon looks surprised, but Chris uses the opportunity to claim that he came to witness the rumored prowess of the great Black Swamp Knights and is disappointed by what he has seen. He openly asks whether anyone else is willing to step forward, and questions whether the Black Swamp Knights are really such a cowardly order. The trainees become increasingly frustrated, and one man finally steps forward, introducing himself as Torin. Chris recognizes that they have fallen directly into his trap and gestures for Torin to attack. Torin leaps through the air with his sword raised overhead. Chris realizes that he never expected the knights to willingly demonstrate their secret techniques, but since they have done so, he has no choice but to steal what he can from them. As they exchange attacks, Chris carefully studies Torin's grip, footwork, and sword movements. He recognizes the style as the mud swordsmanship he had only heard about in rumors. Chris begins copying the movements during the fight, wondering whether the technique will work for him. He quickly adapts to it and strikes Torin across the face, knocking the weapon from his hand. The result surprises Melon, while Chris is delighted that he successfully reproduced the technique. Torin ends up face down on the ground, and Chris sits on top of him as the others struggle to believe that he is actually this strong. They remember that his darkness core was supposedly ruined, and wonder how he could have reached 1 star. Melon realizes that this confirms her earlier suspicion about Chris. Chris expresses his disappointment, saying he expected more from the Black Swamp Knights. If their skills are truly this poor, he suggests that the blame belongs to their deputy commander. The trainees wonder whether they should stop him, considering how recklessly he is provoking Melon. Melon tells Chris that she understands he is happy about his victory, but he is becoming too carried away. Chris responds by asking her to show him the true skills of the Black Swamp Knights. Melon draws a training sword and swings it forcefully beside him. The impact sends dust flying and completely shatters the ground next to Chris. She declares that defeating a bastard like him would take only a second, while releasing a deep purple aura. Chris asks whether she truly intends to fight him with her full power. Instead, he proposes that they restrict themselves to 1-star level dark energy, prohibit dark magic entirely, and use only wooden weapons. Melon changes her blades and agrees, saying that 1 star is already more than enough, and that she will break both of his legs while using only half of that power. Chris accepts the challenge and puts both of his legs on the line, then asks what she is willing to risk. Melon says she is willing to risk anything because Chris will not be walking away from the training ground today. She immediately dashes toward him. Chris blocks her first attack with his sword, but the impact is far heavier than expected. He is pushed backward as Melon continues attacking from different angles, yet Chris manages to keep up, repeatedly blocking and parrying her strikes. The other trainees notice that Chris has managed to hold his ground against Melon for quite some time. They assume the reason is that her primary weapon is a greatsword. Melon, however, is frustrated because her attacks keep failing to reach him despite Chris being a weakling by all appearances. He should not be able to match her. She recalls that the same thing happened during his fight with Torin. Chris casually points out that things do not seem to be going her way, which only irritates her further. She begins channeling dark aura into her blade and prepares a powerful attack, seemingly pushing against the duel's restrictions. She swings straight down at Chris, but he quickly ducks aside and sees his opening. He rushes forward and drives his head directly into her face, catching her completely off guard. As Melon reels from the impact, she looks at the blood on her hand in disbelief. Chris is relieved that his gamble worked. He realizes that Melon is a spell sword, meaning that once her dark magic is restricted, she cannot rely on physical strength alone to cover an opening in her defense. If she had been a pure swordswoman, his strategy might not have worked. Melon continues staring at the blood before suddenly laughing loudly. She never expected him to use a headbutt and admits that she underestimated him. From this point forward, she decides to take him seriously. Chris points toward her neck and reveals that he scratched her with his fingernail during the headbutt. If he had coated his nails with poison, the outcome would have been very different. Melon accepts her defeat and asks what he wants. However, she also requests another chance to fight him. Chris agrees, but says that if she wants a rematch, he will make a second request as well. Melon agrees to anything. Chris walks up close to her and asks whether she would kneel before him. Melon is stunned and explains that such a condition is impossible because her loyalty belongs to the main family of the dark magic clan, House Baron. Chris already knows that she is here on an assignment from the main family. However, he points out that the problem would disappear if he became the young lord of the clan. Melon dismisses the idea as nonsense, explaining that all 5 recognized successors are direct descendants of the main family. Chris reminds her that there is no rule preventing someone from a branch family from becoming a young lord. As for their second duel, Chris suggests they fight again in 1 month, without any restrictions. Melon is confident that he will have no chance of defeating her then. Chris simply responds that very few things are truly impossible in this world. Melon remains seated, staring at him with blood still on her face. Chris bows and tells her that he will see her in a month, when he will show her where her loyalty truly belongs. Later, Chris hands his letter of recommendation to his father and comments that the Fiend's fundamentals are lacking, meaning they need to focus more seriously on their training. A flashback shows Melon speaking with Count Khazar. She tells him that Chris is a genius. Despite his low star rank, he easily defeated fiends with solid foundations and even managed to defeat her. Count Khazar asks whether she is serious, and Melon confirms that she is. For her, it was a rare fight that she genuinely enjoyed. His father still struggles to trust Chris, but he can no longer deny that his son's efforts are producing results. When Chris asks whether there is something on his face, his father brushes it off and simply gives him the library key as promised. Chris leaves satisfied, knowing that this is exactly what he wanted. He has obtained access to the library and even changed Melon's opinion of him. He remembers that Melon belongs to the main family of the Dark Magic clan and, during the Age of Destruction, she became an active 6-star High Fiend. If Chris wants to take control of the entire Dark Magic clan, he needs to make her one of his people. He has not completely won her over yet, but he believes 1 month will be enough because he considers himself a genius. Thinking about Count Khazar, Chris recalls the pride he saw in his father's expression earlier. It makes sense to him because even fiends can form familiar attachments. Perhaps Count Khazar might even become a better father than the one Chris had in his previous life. For the first time, Chris truly accepts Count Khazar as his father and silently promises not to disappoint him. Inside the library, Chris discovers studies on blood magic summoning, curses, and other subjects forbidden in the Dominion of Light. He takes one of the books and pulls it from the shelf, only to find Mary smiling behind it. The sight nearly gives him a heart attack. He asks why she is there, and Mary explains that she was once the librarian here. She then makes the books around them float, and jokingly suggests that Chris came here knowing this because he wanted to keep her all to himself. Chris tells her to stop, but Mary continues teasing him about how his direct words are making her heart race. Later, Mary explains that the grimoire Chris selected contains a 4-star dark magic spell called Binding Seal. In his current state, she doubts he can comprehend it. Chris closes the book but remains confident, reminding her that he is a genius. Mary clearly does not believe him but pretends otherwise, sarcastically praising him for being both handsome and intelligent. Chris immediately recognizes that she is forcing the compliment and tells her to stop. When Mary asks why he specifically chose that book, Chris explains that he needs it to catch a rat. Later, while training with the others, Chris considers the possible suspects. The first is someone within the house who hates him more than anyone else for being a good-for-nothing. The second is Cox. Although Cox is not a descendant of the clan, he has unrestricted access to the punishment cave, and since fiends value strength more than social status, his position is suspicious. At the same time, Cox constantly follows Chris around and tries to please him. There could also be a third party Chris has not yet identified. Whoever it is clearly wants to see him ruined, especially considering the dreamstone that was provided to him in the punishment cave. Chris considers acting like the bastard everyone expects him to be. If someone becomes noticeably pleased by his return to his old behavior, that person could reveal themselves. He suddenly complains that the training is far too difficult, quits, and leaves while telling the others to enjoy themselves. The trainees are left wondering what is wrong with him. At dinner, Chris deliberately smashes a plate and blames the servant for giving him improper food, ordering her to remake it instead of standing there. Count Khazar is disappointed, believing he was foolish to think his son had finally matured. He leaves the room while Chris feels guilty but believes this is necessary for the family's sake. Chris has deliberately worked to spread rumors that he has returned to his old ways. He bullies the maids while they clean and wastes money recklessly, doing everything possible to make himself appear like the old Christian. Mary pours wine for him, but Chris asks why she will not let him drink it. She points out that he is already drinking it, but Chris immediately recognizes that it is non-alcoholic. Mary explains that he is still underage and cannot drink alcohol. Chris wonders why that matters when he is supposed to be a good-for-nothing anyway. Mary asks whether he has decided to become a bastard again and says that if so, she will simply remain by his side regardless. Chris reminds her that he is doing all of this because he is trying to catch a rat. A spell suddenly forms in front of him, surprising Mary when she realizes that he has already mastered the binding seal. Chris casually reminds her that he told her he was a genius, and explains that he modified the spell so it could be used at a lower star level. He has not been wasting his time and has actually been working hard to master various spells. Mary begins wondering whether he might really be a genius. Suddenly the door is slammed open. Chris immediately tells Mary that he needs to act drunk and asks what the intruder is doing there. The person confronting him questions whether this is really the best he can do, believing Chris had genuinely changed for the better. Chris recognizes the anger in his father's voice and quietly crosses him off the list of suspects. He then tells Mary that he believes there is a rat hiding somewhere inside the house. When she asks what he means, Chris explains that someone wants to see his downfall, so he intends to play along with them for a while. Mary asks whether everything is an act. Chris confirms that it is, including the wine. She smells it and immediately realizes that there is no alcohol in it. When she asks who the rat is, Chris admits that he cannot say yet, but they should continue baiting the culprit. Chris throws the wine bottle onto the floor, prompting a butler to rush in and ask what happened. Chris complains that this is not the wine he ordered and demands another bottle. The butler explains that Cox is currently occupied. Chris decides that he will have to visit Cox himself, continuing to act drunk while privately noting that he is playing the role almost too well. Chris soon arrives at Cox's location and slams a bottle down directly in front of him. Cox asks why Chris has come. Chris pours the bottle over Cox's head and complains that it is not the wine he requested. Cox insists that he would never look down on Chris and offers to have someone fetch a proper bottle immediately. Chris refuses and orders Cox to get it himself. Cox, visibly frustrated, explains that he is in the middle of something. Chris asks whether he intends to keep working like that and reminds him that he needs to change anyway. Cox begins visibly trembling before agreeing to return soon. He then leaves the room. Chris commends Cox for enduring all that humiliation without losing his patience, but he can clearly sense the hostility beneath it. He begins examining the paperwork Cox has been handling and soon notices something suspicious. Smiling, Chris realizes this must be it. If Cox is the rat, then he should have been doing something unusual with the family's finances. However, this alone is not enough. Chris needs a real smoking gun. Cox soon returns with the wine. Chris thanks him and asks whether he is angry about what happened earlier. Cox denies being upset, prompting Chris to laugh and call him his favorite. Cox appreciates the sentiment but then delivers a message. Some of Chris's friends want to meet him secretly at their usual place. Chris asks what he means, and Cox explains that although he would rather Chris not associate with those people, it is not his place to judge his master's friends. Chris decides to meet them. Cox tells him to do as he wishes, then smiles slightly after leaving, pleased that everything is going even better than expected. Later, Chris sits at a table surrounded by food. One of the men tells him that rumors are spreading about how much he has changed, though he still does not believe Chris is the best among them. Chris notices a young woman beside him and realizes they have even brought a girl to pour their drinks. He considers the whole arrangement pathetic. Turd encourages him to have a drink. Chris raises the glass but suddenly senses something wrong and throws it directly into Turd's face. Turd panics and coughs, demanding to know what Chris is doing. Chris immediately realizes from his reaction that the alcohol was tainted and that Turd knew something had been added to it. Chris raises his hand and forms a magic spell against the girl's forehead. The spell activates and she collapses unconscious. His friends are stunned that Chris can use dark magic. Chris tells them that this is hardly the time to be surprised. He grabs Turd and Pomodore by their heads and repeatedly slams them against the table. Turd desperately asks why Chris is doing this and tries to calm him down. Chris warns that if they still cannot figure out what they did wrong after taking such a beating, then they can die right there. He eventually draws a knife. Later, Turd and Pomodore are tied up, with Pomodore having even wet himself while begging for mercy. They confess that they were ordered to drug Chris and frame him after killing the girl. Turd explains that they were threatened because of the drugs they had been secretly dealing, leaving them with no choice. Chris demands to know who gave the order. Pomodore hesitates, so Chris moves the knife toward his crotch and threatens to cut it off if he does not answer. They immediately reveal that Cox ordered them to do it and swear they will do anything to survive. Chris asks whether they truly mean that. They swear again, but Chris claims he cannot hear them, forcing them to shout their agreement even louder. Satisfied, Chris accepts their word and begins casting another spell. The magic flies toward their foreheads and he orders them to listen carefully and carry out everything he tells them. Both men collapse unconscious, with Pomodore later foaming slightly at the mouth. Cox rushes into Count Kazar's office and reports that there is a problem. He claims that the young master has committed murder explaining that Chris supposedly became drunk at night, killed the person who served him drinks, and threw the body into the river. Cox insists that the matter cannot be overlooked and asks what should be done. Count Khazar orders him to bring Chris before the Fiend Court and invokes an immediate trial. Cox smiles to himself, believing everything is proceeding exactly according to plan. At the court, Chris stands trial and insists that he is innocent. His father questions whether he really intends to lie despite the existence of witnesses. Chris denies that the murder ever happened and says there must have been a misunderstanding. Then the supposedly dead servant enters the courtroom. Turd and Pomodore are visibly shocked. The young woman explains that Chris took her home after she regained consciousness and even gave her money to help with her rent. She then reveals that Turd and Pomodore were the ones who drugged Chris's drink. Count Khazar demands to know what is happening. Chris decides it is time to end the charade and begins activating his magic. Turd admits that the accusation against Chris was false, while Pomodore reveals that they were ordered by Cox to frame the young master. Cox immediately panics and calls their accusation slander. He claims that Chris and his friends are simply trying to frame him and tells Chris that his joke has gone too far. Chris expected this reaction. As the victim of the incident, he asks his father for permission to act as his representative and personally question Cox. Count Khazar is confused by the request but agrees. He allows Chris to take the defendant's stand while warning that his borrowed authority will be revoked immediately if he acts inappropriately. Chris promises to finish quickly. As the representative of the Demon Emperor, a member of the Dark Magic clan governing the eastern region of the Southern Magic Kingdom, and the representative of Count Khazar, Chris formally begins questioning the defendant. He asks Cox to swear that he will answer every question truthfully. Cox agrees. Chris then repeats the oath under his authority as the Demon Emperor's representative. Cox swears again, and a magical seal immediately flows toward his forehead. Cox grabs his head in pain, confused about what is happening. The others recognize the spell as the Binding Seal and are shocked that Chris can use a 4-star dark magic spell. Chris explains that he modified the spell so it can be used at a lower star rank. However, the modified version has an additional condition: the target must swear twice. Cox has now fallen directly into his trap. Chris reminds him that he just swore to answer nothing but the truth, and asks why he hired his friends to slander him. Cox's head begins throbbing violently, and he screams as the Binding Seal forces the truth from him. He admits that he received an order from someone who knew about his corruption and threatened him into ruining the young master. That is why he had been sabotaging Chris since he was young. Chris points out that by corruption, Cox means the embezzlement he has been committing for years, something Chris had already discovered. He then demands to know who gave the order. Cox hesitates, knowing that revealing the name will put him in danger, but Chris activates the Binding Seal again and orders him to speak. Cox finally reveals that the order came from Sir Eskett, the second son. Realizing the danger he is now in, Cox panics and prepares to flee before Eskett can kill him. Chris immediately takes a nearby guard's sword and cuts Cox's head off. Count Khazar is stunned. Chris calmly explains that, under the authority his father lent him, he has punished the sinner. His father asks why he chose to kill Cox. Chris explains that if Cox had been left alive, the main family could have fabricated evidence and covered up the incident. They cannot afford to be lenient, and Chris intends to make sure everyone remembers the truth and the fact that Cox tried to sabotage him. His father looks uneasy before snapping his fingers and opening a gateway behind him. He tells Chris to follow him. Chris enters and asks where they are. His father explains that it is a secret training ground because there were too many eyes in the courtroom. He then returns to Chris's earlier statement, asking whether Eskett is likely to cause more trouble because of the succession conflict. A family's power and authority are directly connected to the successor it supports. Count Khazar admits that Chris's decision was correct, although he feels he may have acted too quickly. Given the current situation, their family will have to support the first young lady. The first young lord is not an option because he is a bloodthirsty lunatic. Chris then presents another possibility: he could become the successor himself. His father immediately dismisses the idea as nonsense. Chris points out that there is no rule preventing someone from a branch family from being recognized as a successor if they possess the necessary ability. His father explains that such recognition would only exist in name and would not actually carry authority. Chris questions why Eskett would bother sabotaging him if he were truly irrelevant. His father admits that Chris may have been more talented than Eskett during childhood, but he has fallen far behind him now. Chris confidently says he can close the gap quickly, but he needs his father's help. He asks Count Khazar to use his authority to recommend him for the Sacred Dark Rite competition. His father rejects the request as well, explaining that the competition is only 2 months away and Chris must reach 2 stars to participate. He has only just reached 1 star. Chris promises to reach 2 stars within those 2 months and asks his father to help him this one time. Later, the maids discuss how Chris seems to have genuinely changed. They have also heard that Count Khazar himself has been personally training him. They wonder whether he is receiving the same training that even Senior Knight struggled to endure and speculate about how long Chris will actually be able to last. Chris cleanly cuts a target in half and explains that he needs to combine mud swordsmanship with blackside swordsmanship, asking his father if he is doing it correctly. His father is surprised because he only started teaching him the technique that day. Yet Chris understood it immediately. Chris questions why he has to keep the two techniques separate, saying it feels like there should be a more efficient method. A mushroom monster suddenly appears and Chris rushes forward, slicing off its legs. His father points out that he used mud swordsmanship, which is not designed for cutting. Chris explains that he simply wrapped the mud swordsmanship in blackside sword energy. Internally, his father is stunned because a 1-star should not be capable of combining two techniques like that. He keeps his composure and comments on how powerful it is, but warns that using two techniques simultaneously should make casting curses difficult. Chris immediately proves otherwise by casting a curse without trouble. He considers it easy and says the combination is not an inconvenience at all. His father can no longer hide his shock. 2 weeks later, Chris lies exhausted on the ground after running. He complains about how difficult running is but knows he cannot neglect it because stamina is essential for increasing his power stage. Melon approaches and asks whether he is already exhausted, reminding him that their duel is approaching and that she is looking forward to the promised day. Chris comments on her intense presence and says he is doing his best to meet her expectations. Melon acknowledges his growth but reminds him that he is still only a 1-star and will never make her kneel before him. Chris remains confident that he will eventually succeed. Even if he does not, he believes the duel will still teach him something, so it will not be a waste. Melon laughs and hopes he continues pushing beyond his limits so he can entertain her. Chris notes that Melon is currently an upper 4-star. Each stage is divided into 3 tiers, lower, middle, and upper, meaning that as an upper 1-star he is still far below her level. Fortunately, coming from a wealthy family gives him another advantage. He is essentially a wallet warrior. Back in his room, Chris asks Mary whether she has finished packing his bag for their outing. She confirms that she has and explains that since it is their first outing together, she made sure to dress appropriately. Chris reminds her that he never said she was coming with him. Mary acts disappointed and jokes that she will suffer from a heat stroke while serving him, though Chris questions how a banshee could even suffer one. Chris remembers asking his father whether he could replace Mary with a human attendant. His father refused because Christian had already made a contract with her, explaining that a high-ranked banshee cannot be controlled without one. Chris even asked how the contract could be avoided, only to learn that it requires sharing a deep kiss with Mary. He cannot believe his previous self actually did that. Chris tells Mary that she cannot accompany him because he is going somewhere crowded, and her spiritual energy could potentially harm people. Mary becomes visibly sad, explaining that she has been confined inside for decades and was looking forward to going outside. Seeing her reaction, Chris eventually gives in, telling her she can come but must avoid appearing in front of others. Mary becomes excited and praises him as the best master. Chris tells her to follow him. When she asks where they are going, he explains that he is heading somewhere he can make a profit. Mary reminds him that he already has plenty of money, prompting Chris to drop his coins onto the floor and tell her to stop wasting them. She guesses that he must instead be after land ownership, but Chris rejects that idea as well. When she asks what he is actually after, he simply says it is something he used in the past. They soon arrive at a carriage where Thorn is already waiting. Chris asks why he is there, and Thorn explains that he came to watch over him in case he starts behaving like a bastard again. Chris tells him not to worry because he is only going gambling. As fiends naturally enjoy alcohol and gambling, he sees nothing unusual about it. He even points out that gambling is legal and recommended by the Demon Emperor. Chris tells Thorn to follow him. He then wonders whether his brother is secretly worried about his older brother. Thorn immediately denies this, saying he is only concerned that Chris will dishonor the family. Chris jokes that gambling might be too stimulating for a little nerd like Thorn and asks whether he even knows the rules. Thorn explains that it is simply a matter of playing cards and warns Chris that he will flatten his nose if he keeps talking. Chris pretends to be frightened and promises to show Thorn just how much of a pushover he is. They eventually arrive at an enormous, luxurious building. Even Mary is impressed by its appearance, while Thorn admits that he has never seen a building like it. Mary's excitement grows, but Chris tells them to stop acting like country bumpkins. He gives Thorn a mask and tells Mary to hide so no one notices her. Chris whispers something to Mary, and she agrees to follow his instructions before disappearing. Thorn asks where he sent her, but Chris tells him not to worry about it and urges him to go inside. As they enter, gamblers glance toward them, surprised that people so young would willingly walk into what they consider a lion's den. Chris proposes a bet with Thorn. Whoever makes more money within an hour will win. If Chris wins, Thorn must call him older brother for a month. Thorn asks whether he is serious, and Chris confirms it. If Thorn wins, however, Chris must call him the Honorable King, Emperor, Majesty brother. Thorn cannot believe Chris can say something so ridiculous with a straight face. Chris tells him they do not have to make the bet if he is scared and even offers him some money. Thorn immediately snatches it, insisting that he is not afraid and that he will go first to show Chris how easy gambling is. Later at a gambling table, an observer comments on Chris's victory and is impressed by how well he plays despite his age. Chris understands exactly what is happening. Beginners are allowed to win reasonable amounts at first to make them overconfident. Once the target starts betting too much, the con men reel him in. Chris knows this method well and realizes Thorn has already fallen into their trap. He tells Thorn to go home and sleep because he is clearly losing money. Thorn insists that he has only lost 500, but Chris points out that he has already lost around 1,000. The others laugh as Thorn begins to lose his composure. Chris realizes that everyone has already marked Thorn as a loser and expects the con men to reel him in even further. He asks Thorn whether he plans to continue. Thorn says he will and throws more money into the game. Chris claims that he tried to stop him but secretly wants Thorn to lose as much as possible and become the perfect bait. That was the plan from the beginning. Later, Chris sits at another table and studies his cards. He notices several gamblers cheating by looking at his hand. Just then, Mary appears behind him and informs him that she has found the people he was looking for. Chris praises her work while internally becoming excited that his plan is finally progressing. A short while later, they arrive at their destination. Mary confirms that this is the place, and Chris tells her to open the door. She does so, and the people inside immediately panic when they see them. Chris removes his mask and asks whether they really do not recognize him. He orders them to bring their master out. One of the men immediately becomes extremely respectful and asks whether Chris has truly come to visit. The man is Grant, the master of the Glee Merchant Guild. Although he is famous for his talent as a merchant, Chris learns that Grant also owns the casino. Chris requests a private conversation. Grant asks what the matter is, and Chris explains that his younger brother, whom he cares deeply about, was conned at his casino. He then questions how Grant can still ask why he came. Grant is stunned to realize that the young gambler wearing the tiger mask is actually Chris's brother. Chris corrects him by identifying himself as the son of Count Khazar. Grant immediately insists that he only operates the casino and claims that the people involved have nothing to do with him. Mary then frightens him with her presence. Grant immediately apologizes and begs for mercy, saying that he never would have allowed such a thing if he had known Chris was the Count's son. Chris asks whether those are merely empty words. Grant assures him that they are not and offers compensation, asking how much Chris wants. Chris initially demands 1 million rupees, leaving Grant stunned because the casino cannot simply produce that amount on hand. Chris then reduces his demand to 200,000 rupees. Grant is surprised that such a small amount will settle the matter. Chris tells him that there is one more thing he wants. Grant asks what it is. Later, Chris examines the brand new equipment he has acquired. Mary is surprised that he used the 200,000 rupees to purchase gear and considers it another clever scheme. She then notices the sword he obtained and finds it unusual. The sword is called Grenade. Mary recognizes it as a holy sword once obtained by a past hero who sacrificed his soul to acquire it. She has heard that many fiends desire the weapon because it was used by the hero after his fall. However, the once renowned sword is now completely covered in rust. Chris tells Mary not to worry because the rusty holy sword is part of his plan. He then hands her a necklace, explaining that he noticed her staring at it earlier and wants her to have it as a gift. He says that if she kept regretting not having it, she might never be able to put her past to rest, so he wants her to have it and move on quickly. Mary is stunned because, both before and after her death, this is the first time anyone has ever given her a gift. She sincerely thanks him. Chris gets caught up in the moment and tells her they should hurry home. Mary gives him a warm smile and promises to put her whole heart into serving him as thanks. From now on, she says she will make his blood juice even tastier. As they walk home, Chris immediately says that he has no interest in drinking something like that. Their usual banter continues, with Mary insisting that he must have known the strawberry juice he has been drinking was actually blood. Chris tells her to stop joking, then suddenly pauses because he feels like he has forgotten something. He soon realizes what it is, the ring he left at the casino. The next morning, Chris is woken by someone shouting at him. He wonders what is going on and then asks why his brother abandoned him. Thorn angrily explains that Chris nearly got him sold as a debt slave because of his actions, and that he was only spared because someone recognized him. Chris apologizes, but assumes Grant must have helped him. He then reminds Thorn that he lost their bet and needs to fulfill his promise. Thorn looks mortified and squeezes the pillow tightly, before reluctantly beginning to say the required title. Chris pretends he cannot understand him until Thorn finally shouts out the full title, Esteemed King, Emperor, Majesty Brother. Chris is satisfied and tells Thorn to remember to respect him, while also striving to do well for himself. Thorn vows that he will get his revenge someday. Chris cannot believe that such an adorable child will eventually grow up to kill his older brother. He realizes that this future is connected to Eskit, the son of Langum, the acting head of the Dark Magic clan and the #1 young lord. Chris does not feel particularly attached to Eskett because he is not the original Christian. However, if he intends to become the young lord, he cannot avoid confronting him, and he decides to settle that grudge personally. To accomplish that, he first needs Melon on his side. Chris then looks down at the holy sword as he kneels beside it. Countless fiends have attempted to wield this weapon in the past, and the reason it is now treated as little more than an antique is that nobody has ever succeeded. Chris believes it may react differently to him. He grabs its chains, but the sword immediately releases a burst of holy energy that shocks his hand away. Chris examines his injured hand and considers the reaction expected. The sword was created as an artifact for wielding the holy power of light. Still, it is ultimately just a weapon, and if he can analyze the mechanism causing it to reject dark energy, he should be able to use it. He begins hammering the sword repeatedly. Each strike causes it to release another burst of holy energy, gradually destroying the hammer upon contact. After several attempts, Chris asks Grenade whether it hurts and pulls out another hammer. He tells the sword to submit because he intends to keep hitting it all night. A few days later, Chris arrives at the secret training ground where his father asks whether he has finished preparing. Chris confirms that he has. A woman stands before him, and Chris initially wonders where he has seen her before. He soon recognizes her and greets Marion, the commander of the Black Shadow Knights. She says it has been a while, revealing that she is Chris's aunt and the daughter of the Elder Clan head, the master of the Dark Magic Clan. She is also the older sister of Chris's father, Raiden, and Count Langam. Marion protects the Elder Clan head and oversees secret missions and surveillance within the clan. As one of the elite among the elites, Chris wonders why someone of her position has come here. Raiden explains that his sister came because of the matter involving Cox. Marion laughs at Chris's bold handling of the situation. Chris wonders whether the Elder Clan head intends to protect Eskett, which could become troublesome. He remarks that the Elder Clan head must have plenty of free time if he is concerned with such trivial matters. Marion calls Chris bold but explains that the clan head has no interest in the squabbles between children. Instead, he appears to be interested in Chris himself. Chris is surprised and sees this as an opportunity to gain the Elder Clan head's favor. Marion wonders whether his behavior is bravery or simple stupidity. He has not even reached 2 stars. Yet he is challenging Melon and should seriously consider canceling the duel. Chris thanks her for worrying about him but says he has his own plans. When he reveals the holy sword, Marion immediately recognizes Grenade and assumes Chris has completely lost his mind. She knew he was a troublemaker, but not to this extent. Marion also recalls how Raiden kept telling her that Chris had changed for the better. Raiden confirms that he has. Marion points out that Chris is planning to use a holy sword in a duel. Chris questions why that would be forbidden when all that matters is winning, regardless of the method or trick involved. Marion warns him that even the Elder Clan head failed to tame Grenade, and that its holy power will burn Chris to ashes. Chris calmly asks whether that is true and begins removing the sword from its sheath. Marion immediately warns him that it is dangerous as a faint golden light begins to emerge. Nothing happens. Marion stares at him in disbelief and wonders whether the weapon is a replica. Chris tosses the sword toward her and tells her to check it herself. The moment she catches it, the sword releases a powerful shock through her hand, forcing her to throw it onto the ground. Marion demands to know how Chris can wield it. Chris calls it a trade secret and refuses to explain. However, he assures her that there is one thing she can be certain of. The only reason he can wield a holy sword that even the Elder Clan head failed to tame is because he is a genius. Raiden cannot help but feel proud of his son. Just then, Melon laughs and says that Chris is always entertaining. She admits that taming a holy sword is impressive, but insists that it will not matter because today will be his last day alive. Chris turns his attention toward her. The duel begins. Melon charges forward and swings down with overwhelming force. Chris blocks the attack and immediately realizes that, without restrictions, her speed and power are incomparable to their previous duel. There is no way for him to close the gap through strength alone. She attacks again and Chris blocks once more. However, the holy sword begins dispersing the dark aura surrounding Melon's blade. Raiden and Marion are surprised to see the sword directly opposing her dark energy. Raiden remarks that Chris may have already surpassed Melon's younger self. Marion points out that this is not the only factor. Chris is wielding the holy sword while still maintaining dark energy around his hand. The two powers appear to be clashing against each other. Chris strikes back, forcing Melon to block. Raiden is impressed by the weapon's power but notices that Chris's dark energy seems unstable. Marion realizes that this is not instability. Chris is deliberately controlling his dark energy for brief moments, preventing the holy sword from rejecting it. Melon creates distance and asks whether the battle is finally to Chris's liking. She admits that she has been wondering about something and asks whether he has been predicting her movements. Chris confirms that he is simply observant. Every sword technique begins with a specific position. Before Melon can swing downward, she must raise her arms, which requires movement in the muscles of her shoulders and upper body. Those physical preparations are the same whether the swordsman is a novice or an expert. Melon sighs and wonders how he intends to predict her forever. A green aura suddenly emerges from her hand and wraps around Chris. She reminds him that the Black Swamp Knights are spell swords. A massive surge of holy energy suddenly resonates from Chris. Chris realizes that the attack could have been dangerous, but he has a cleansing artifact. Melon asks whether he brought one. Chris thanks his father for providing it, and remembers that the artifact was supposed to be stored in the secret vault. When questioned about how he obtained it, Chris admits that he can be a bit of a kleptomaniac, but explains that having good equipment is a skill in itself during a real battle. He reaches into his pocket and throws an object toward Melon. It explodes. Melon desperately dodges the blast, but Chris tells her there is no point, because he throws another one directly at her. The second artifact explodes as well. Chris explains that he purchased the artifact with the money he obtained from Glee and remarks that it is surprisingly effective. He tells Melon that he knows she is still alive and urges her to come out. Melon suddenly emerges and thrusts her sword directly toward him. Chris redirects her blade and matches her movement, striking the tip of her sword. A crack spreads through the blade until it completely shatters. Raiden finally understands why Chris threw the corrosion marble into the air. His son had deliberately prepared the battlefield to weaken Melon's weapon. Raiden can only conclude that Chris truly is a genius. Melon walks forward laughing, then begins smiling as she admits that the fight is far too enjoyable and wonders what Chris will use next. Marion realizes that Melon has become completely absorbed in the battle and says they need to stop her. Chris leans backward and raises his hand, deflecting Melon's attack with the smallest possible movement. He immediately pivots behind her and places his blade against her throat. Melon is caught off guard as Chris declares his victory. The blade lightly cuts her cheek, and he asks whether she is satisfied with the result. Raiden watches with obvious pride. Melon laughs again, saying that if Chris is genuinely asking, she cannot even calm herself down anymore. Chris reminds her of his previous request and asks for an answer as soon as possible. Although he won, he says he will respect her decision if she refuses, because loyalty cannot be forced. Melon asks whether he will continue fighting her like this if she chooses to stand by his side. Chris takes her hand and assures her that he will fight her as much as she wants. Later, Marion watches the sunset and reflects on what she has witnessed. She comments that Chris's ability to wield dark energy in such a manner is truly exceptional. Nearby, a man throws the holy sword onto the ground and refuses to wield it. Marion asks whether he is incapable of holding it as well. He explains that he can wield it for a brief moment, but dark energy constantly changes its waves. To use the sword, one must continuously alter those waves into a form the sword cannot detect. No one could realistically do that during an actual battle. He believes it might only be possible for a demon of Gahong or a demonic dragon, or perhaps some insane individual capable of controlling dark energy as naturally as breathing. Marion remembers Chris smiling confidently and asking whether his performance was enough to earn her praise. She cannot help but smile as well, wondering whether her father's long-held wish might finally be fulfilled. Later, Chris enters the kitchen and finds an intimidating-looking orc preparing food. The orc expertly cuts a strawberry in half and places it on top of a cheesecake. Chris cannot believe he is making strawberry cakes, while Mary praises the orc's skills despite his appearance. The orc asks what brings Chris to the kitchen. Chris explains that he wants to make some cookies. Mary asks why he is making them, and Chris says they are for someone else. She immediately wonders whether the gift is for another woman. Chris explains that it is technically for a woman, but not in the way Mary thinks. The orc offers to make the cookies for him, but Chris refuses because preparing heartfelt snacks with his own hands is what matters. Before he can finish, an unidentified red substance splashes onto his cheek as the orcs aggressively mash strawberries into jam. Chris suspiciously asks Mary whether she is certain they are not mixing blood into the strawberry juice. Mary simply laughs. Later that evening, Chris calls out to Marion as she prepares to mount her horse. She asks what he wants, and Chris explains that he heard she was leaving and came to say goodbye. Marion appreciates the gesture and assumes he must still be tired from their duel the previous day. Chris says he is fine and reveals that he also has a gift for her. Marion sees the box of cookies and blushes, saying that he did not need to prepare anything. Chris explains that he was happy to see her again and could not help making something for her. He remembers asking earlier what kind of food Marion likes and decides that cookies would be a good choice. He asks her to try one because he baked them himself. Marion is surprised that Chris actually made them, but takes a bite and discovers that they are surprisingly delicious. She praises the taste, and Chris is pleased that she likes them. Marion says that she should give him something in return, and asks whether there is anything he wants. Chris asks her to become his true aunt from now on. Marion understands that his words must have a deeper meaning despite their existing blood relation. She asks whether he is really seeking her support in the upcoming succession conflict. She sighs and explains that she cannot grant such a request. As an adult from the main family, she must remain impartial toward all candidates because that is the rule. Chris insists that his request is genuine and that he simply wants to become closer to his aunt. Marion asks whether he truly has no other intentions. Chris admits that if she genuinely cherishes him and secretly offers to help, he certainly would not refuse. Marion laughs as she continues eating the cookies, saying she does not dislike his honesty. Since her nephew makes such delicious cookies for her, she cannot help but cherish him. Chris thanks her, and Marion asks whether she can have more cookies next time. Raiden watches the exchange with tears in his eyes, touched by the wholesome moment. Chris jokingly warns Marion that if she makes him sad, he might become too upset to recreate the same taste again, hoping she understands what he means. Marion sighs but remains happy, and then asks Chris what he thinks about joining the Black Shadow Knights. Before he can fully respond, she explains that his performance against Melon was exceptional. He may even be a greater prodigy than the Elder Clan head. However, his rivals will not be easy to defeat, and she worries that his talent might disappear before it has the chance to fully bloom. Chris says that if he cannot climb over the mountain standing in his way, then he would not mind dying. Marion is surprised by his answer, but Chris assures her that he appreciates her concern and does not believe he will lose again. Amused by his confidence, Marion admits that for some reason, if it is this child, she feels capable of believing him. She cannot stop him from choosing this path, but she offers him one piece of advice: he should be wary of the first young lady. Raiden asks why he should be wary of Juliana when she is considered the gentlest among the 5 young lords. Marion simply says that he will understand the reason soon. Chris thanks her and promises to remember her warning. Marion smiles, says they will meet again, and rides away. That night, Chris lies in bed thinking about everything that has happened. Both his father and Marion have reached 6 stars, yet he remembers hearing surprisingly little about them during the Great War. He wonders just how many powerful combatants exist within the Magic Empire. There must be enough of them to overwhelm the Dominion of Light at the very least. Chris refuses to repeat the mistakes of his previous life, and decides that he needs to become stronger much faster. 1 month passes. Chris is summoned by his father and asks what he wanted to discuss. Raiden is initially distracted by Chris's appearance before realizing that his son has already reached 2 stars. He cannot believe Chris achieved such growth in only a month. Chris reminds him that he promised he would reach 2 stars and asks why he was summoned so late at night. Raiden explains that he received word from the main family. He submitted both Chris and another candidate for the Sacred Dark Rite, but only the other candidate was approved. The reason is Chris's terrible reputation, his frivolous spending, womanizing, theft, drunken behavior, and destruction of property. Raiden cannot even refute the accusations because they are all true. Despite this, he cannot believe they are still looking down on his son. Chris asks whether Count Langam made the decision. Raiden explains that Langam did not have much to say about Chris's past misconduct. The real issue is Eskit, a direct descendant of the main family and the star of the upcoming Sacred Dark Rite. The Sacred Dark Rite is a ritual in which candidates absorb pure darkness from the negative dimension. Because the amount of darkness available is limited, the candidates effectively participate in a death match to determine their hierarchy. Those who rank higher receive more of the darkness. The ritual plays a major role in determining who will become the young lord and successor of the clan. If Eskit wins and monopolizes the available darkness, Chris's goal of becoming the 6th young lord will become far more difficult. Raiden promises that if that happens, he will speak with the main family again, and if necessary, even ask Marion for help. Chris tells him that such measures are unnecessary because he will handle the situation himself. Raiden acknowledges that Chris is talented and has genuinely changed, but tells him to leave matters like this to the adults. Chris understands that his father is genuinely trying to protect him. He appreciates Raiden's feelings, but insists that he has his own methods. Chris then asks whether any children from Count Trauman's house will participate. Raiden confirms that the 3rd son will be there and explains that the young lord has sided with Eskit. He believes Chris has no right to participate in the Sacred Dark Rite, and considers him nothing more than a trickster who can only control demon beasts. Chris is surprised that his father is being so supportive and tells him to calm down. He simply needs to prove himself. He also expects the Trauman family to host a black pill soon and plans to participate as a herder. The scene then shifts to what appears to be the main estate of the clan. Marion reports to the Elder Clan head that she personally checked on Christian according to his orders. When asked about Chris, she says that he is incomparable to the others. The Elder Clan head finds that difficult to believe. The child he remembers was nothing more than a brat who believed himself to be a genius despite being only a false prodigy. Marion explains that Chris is clearly different from before. The Elder Clan head asks whether she believes Chris could fulfill his long-awaited wish. She explains that this wish is the very reason her father has continued living, even defying death through heaven-defying magic. Marion cannot say for certain whether Chris can fulfill it, but she believes he may be the closest person to achieving what he desires. The Elder Clan head finds this interesting and decides to keep watching Chris. He asks whether Chris's participation in the upcoming Sacred Dark Rite is unlikely. Marion confirms that this is the general consensus within the clan. When he asks whether she expects him to intervene, he refuses, saying he cannot interfere in such a trivial matter. He questions how someone can call himself a fierce beast if he cannot overcome such a small trial. Marion agrees that Chris may be a fierce beast, but he is still only a child. She believes he should at least be given an opportunity to receive darkness and awaken his potential. The Elder Clan head suddenly calls her name in a stern voice, making Marion realize that she has overstepped her boundaries. He explains that he has always been this way, becoming particularly harsh toward those he has expectations for. Since Marion is willing to go so far for Chris, he concludes that she has taken a liking to him. He then summons Bloodrinker, the Dark Magic clan's head butler, Simon. Simon enters and asks whether he has been called, though he already knows what is happening. He has heard everything and says that Chris is now under observation. The Elder Clan head confirms that he wants Simon to watch Chris closely and report everything he does leading up to the sacred dark rite. Simon agrees but asks whether he can play a small prank while monitoring him. Marion is surprised, while the Elder Clan head warns Simon not to go too far. Simon laughs ominously, agrees and leaves. Marion quietly hopes Chris makes it through safely. Meanwhile, Chris rides through a village in a carriage and reflects on his rapid growth. He managed to reach 2 stars quickly thanks to his talent, but despite all his training, his stamina and dark energy reserves are still insufficient to reach 3 stars. He needs a black pill to accumulate a large amount of dark energy in a short period. Fortunately, the fact that the host of the Black Pill Hunt has already developed a grudge against him is a stroke of luck. However, simply capturing the demon beast does not guarantee that he will receive a black pill. There is a special condition that must also be fulfilled. The carriage stops, and Lardos approaches, asking what brings Chris here. Chris asks how he has been and remarks that he surely did not come empty-handed. Lardos proudly says he would never greet the young master without a gift. Chris immediately slaps the gift from his hand, sending it to the ground. He tells Lardos that he clearly does not know his place and that Chris has heard about his various illegal activities. He decides to overlook them this once but orders Lardos to stop crossing the line. Lardos quickly agrees. Chris then tells him he needs an ash pill and asks whether Lardos can procure one. Lardos explains that their price has recently increased. Chris understands and asks Mary whether she is ready. Mary starts laughing, frightening Lardos so badly that he immediately drops to his knees and promises to obtain the pill. Chris finds his cooperation pleasantly simple and adds another request. He wants a dagger sharp enough to cut through armor. Lardos looks confused as Chris leaves. On the way back, Mary asks whether they are finally going home, but Chris says there is one more place he needs to visit. He spots a potion shop and orders the coachman to stop. Inside, Chris looks through the merchandise and begins selecting several items. Mary asks what he needs them for, particularly questioning why he wants an aphrodisiac. Her expression makes it obvious that she is misunderstanding his intentions. Chris becomes nervous as the people around him stare. Mary starts wondering whether the two of them have finally reached that stage, but Chris quickly denies it and insists the items are for someone else. Mary strikes a thoughtful pose and wonders whether they are for the Count. Chris nods. The shopkeeper immediately understands as well, assuming it is related to Raiden's age. Chris tells the shopkeeper that for the Count's honor, this purchase must remain completely secret. The shopkeeper assures him that he will keep quiet. Later, Chris meets Thorn. Chris makes him repeat his full title from their previous bet before speaking to him. Thorn warns Chris that the Black Pill Hunt is dangerous and tells him to avoid getting hurt. Chris wonders whether Thorn is worried about him. Thorn becomes embarrassed and insists that he is only worried they will not get their proper duel. Their father then tells Thorn to make sure Chris flattens the noses of the house, Tyrann bastards. Chris promises to do so and says he will return with good news. Raiden then asks Thorn what the strange King, Emperor, Majesty Brother title from earlier means. Thorn becomes extremely embarrassed and refuses to explain. The scene shifts to the house of Count Tyrann. A small goblin servant tells Chris once again that he is not allowed to enter the Count's mansion. Chris's companions are outraged that he is being treated this way and question whether the servant even knows who he is. The goblin explains that he has orders from his young master and owes nothing to a good-for-nothing bastard. Chris asks whether he is being told to find his own accommodations. The goblin nervously confirms it. One of Chris's companions immediately wants to cut the man's head off, but Chris stops him and instead asks about payment for accommodations. The frightened goblin offers to bill the cost to Count Tyrann. Chris accepts. Soon the group arrives at an extravagant mansion that Chris has rented. The workers are stunned by the property and estimate that it must have cost at least 100,000 rupees. Chris remarks that it is not often they get the chance to spend someone else's money so freely. He gives them an hour to organize their luggage, and then suggests they go out for drinks. Something suddenly moves inside one of the bags. Mary pops out and enthusiastically praises the mansion, saying it is perfect for serving him. Chris asks why she is there. Mary explains that she hid inside his luggage because she promised to remain his maid forever. She also finds his embarrassed reaction adorable and assumes he must have missed her. Before Chris can respond, someone angrily calls out about the bill. It is Yahello, the third son of Count Tyrann. Chris explains that since the host of the Black Pill Hunt told him to find somewhere else to stay, he did exactly that. Since someone of his standing cannot stay in an ordinary hotel, he purchased a decent mansion instead. He questions whether Allo is really arguing over such a small amount of money, and points out that, considering how poorly Allo treats his guests, The price is reasonable compensation for teaching him some manners. Yahello becomes furious and squeezes the bill while releasing magic that summons a panther. He threatens Chris and asks whether he wants to die. Chris immediately recognizes the technique as the Count's subjugation arts. Unlike the Alliance's taming techniques, these are dark magic methods that bind and control demon beasts through fear. Secret formulas are mixed into the technique, disrupting the beast's reasoning and inducing delusions of fear and excitement. Chris finds the technique more complicated than expected. Learning all of it in a short time would be difficult, but for now, he simply wants to beat the beast. Chris tells Mary that he will need a weapon to deal with the frightening cat. Mary laughs and opens their storage. Chris pulls out a weapon and tells Yahello to send the beast at him. Yahello angrily tells Chris not to order him around. The panther charges forward with its mouth open. As it leaps, Chris raises his weapon to block the attack. The beast bites down and shatters the weapon, sending Chris flying backward onto the floor. Chris admits that the beast is not bad, but considers the situation unfair because it is effectively a 2-on-1 fight. He says that if he wins, he will have to participate as a guard rather than a herder, so the challenge needs to be at least this difficult to count. He asks Yahello what he thinks. Yahello insults Chris and jumps onto the panther, ordering it to make Chris kneel. The beast launches another attack, and Yahello confidently watches as it pounces. But when it lands, the panther looks around and realizes Chris is gone. Yahello is equally confused. Chris appears behind them and strikes Yahello once with his weapon, then follows with 3 more blows. He asks whether it hurts and tells Yahello not to start crying. Yahello creates distance, while Chris warns that he will not go easy on him even if he does. Yahello tells him to shut up. Chris then releases a powerful wave of killing intent toward both Yahello and the panther. The beast immediately becomes overwhelmed by fear. It panics, retreats, and eventually runs away, leaving Yahello stunned and asking what Chris did to his Chaco. Chris calmly explains that he only used a simple 2-star illusion spell, but apparently it was too much for Yahello's subjugation arts to overcome. Yahello begins preparing another spell and tells Chris to shut up again. A demonic-looking horse starts emerging from the ground beneath him. Chris asks whether Yahello really understands what kind of person he is. Yahello looks confused, giving Chris the opening he needs. Chris thrusts his weapon forward with tremendous speed and smashes it directly into Yahello's forehead, knocking him to the ground with his eyes rolling white. Chris explains that he does not bother waiting for transformations or finishing lengthy spells. Meanwhile, the poor summoned horse remains stuck halfway out of the ground. Later, Chris is back at the gambling establishment, where someone questions whether he should really be spending his time like this. Chris says there is still plenty of time and that he should rest whenever possible. They point out that gambling hardly counts as resting, but Chris asks what is wrong with a good-for-nothing like himself doing exactly what he is supposed to do. He asks Mary whether she agrees. She happily supports him, though she refuses to give him alcohol despite his desire for some. Chris cannot really argue with her. The goblin from earlier wonders why Yahello ordered them to keep watching such a bastard. Chris invites them to join him at the table. He is confident their master will not wake up until tomorrow after the beating he received, and he promises to keep the matter secret. The 2 men tell Chris to mind his own business, so he tells them to enjoy themselves while they continue watching him until nightfall. Eventually, the goblin and the hyena-like man conclude that Chris really is a good-for-nothing, and that continuing to watch him is pointless. They leave. Chris opens his eyes once they are gone and sits up. Looking outside, he realizes it is already late and decides it is time to move. He tells Mary that he needs to go somewhere quickly and orders her not to follow. Mary immediately becomes suspicious. She knows there is an aphrodisiac in his pouch and realizes it was never meant for the Count. She jokingly assumes Chris plans to use it himself and says that although she is sad she cannot accompany him to bed, she will cheer him on during his nighttime activities. Chris tells her to stop running her mouth. He then reaches the secret hunting grounds of Count Tyrain, where the concentration of demon beast energy is extremely dense. Based on the Count's reputation, Chris knows this must be the place and expects the hunting ground to be nearby. He soon spots it and finds only 2 guards protecting the entrance. The relaxed security works in his favor, especially since Mary taught him the invisibility spell. Mary asks what he plans to do with invisibility magic, but Chris tells her to stop making everything sound suspicious. He easily slips past the guards and moves deeper into the hunting grounds until he reaches an altar. Chris recognizes it as the place where the Black Pill Hunt's finale will take place. Lena, the fox woman he met previously, had already explained how a black pill is created. A demon beast must be driven into such extreme fear that it would rather die than continue living. At that brief moment, intense fear and radiant joy exist on the same spectrum, allowing the otherwise useless ash pill to transform into a black pill. That is why the House of Count Tyrain, which specializes in controlling demon beasts through fear, hosts the Black Pill Hunt. Chris recalls Lena's explanation and reveals that he originally planned to steal their ultimate technique, release the Kagoff after feeding it an aphrodisiac mixed with other substances, and monopolize the resulting black pill. However, he does not have enough time to steal and master their technique. He needs another method. Chris suddenly senses a magical presence and turns around, wondering whether he has been detected. He identifies where the energy is coming from and decides to investigate. He travels deeper into the forest and eventually finds a cave. Pulling his hood over his head, he enters. An ominous red aura brushes past him. Chris immediately senses the overwhelming malice and recognizes the barrier as an extremely high-level dark magic formation. He wonders whether it could be what he thinks it is. A crevice of Gehenna, a passage connecting the demon world to the human world. He cannot believe that such a crevice exists here. Then an idea occurs to him. If he can lure the Kagov here, he may be able to use the crevice to his advantage. And he already has something capable of drawing it here. Chris smiles and decides to wait until the hunt begins. A bat watches him from the cave ceiling. After Chris leaves, the bat spreads its wings and reveals itself as Simon. He admits that he never expected the little bastard to be this interesting. Chris has not only beaten Yahello, but also lowered the vigilance of his observers by deliberately acting like a fool. Now he has secretly entered a forbidden area and is clearly planning something. Simon finds this entertaining enough to want to play an even worse prank on him. He approaches the entrance to Gehenna and places his hand inside. The barrier immediately tears into his flesh, causing blood to drip onto the ground. Something begins absorbing his blood and asks what he desires. Simon prepares to summon a demon. The following day, the black pill hunt begins. Someone plants a flag into the ground. It is Yahello and his group. Chris is also present and remarks that Yahello was acting far too cool for someone who was recently beaten so badly. Yahello tells him to shut up and calls Chris the real poser, questioning why he brought the holy sword when he cannot even properly use it. Chris explains that it is still more effective than a club and asks whether Yahello wants to test it. Yahello quickly changes the subject and orders everyone to lure the demon beast toward the altar. Those assigned to guard duty will follow him and remain beside the altar. Simon watches from nearby while Chris notices him as well. Yahello orders Chris to answer, and Chris simply agrees. At the altar, one of the guards tells Chris to stay somewhere else because he is only getting in the way of the hunt. Chris accepts, but warns them not to come crying to him for help cleaning up when they inevitably die. The remark clearly irritates the guard, but Yahello tells him not to waste his energy before the hunt even begins and orders the good-for-nothing to guard the flag. Chris happily accepts the task and promises to protect it with everything he has. He sits beneath a tree and watches the others prepare, thinking that they are walking directly into his trap. He has also made sure to bring the dagger and ash pill with him. The hunters suddenly hear something approaching. Chris knows exactly what it is. The Kagov finally appears, revealing itself as a rank 4 magic demon beast. Despite its rank, Chris is surprised by how ridiculous and oddly cute it looks. The others ask Yahello whether he is ready and tell him it is time to begin. Yahello's animal companion also urges him to activate the subjugation arts. Yahello extends his hand and begins casting while the Kagov repeatedly strikes the ground with its beak. The others cast slowing spells to restrain its movements. Yahello gradually approaches while applying the subjugation arts. Then something changes within the Kagov's eyes. It suddenly screeches and turns toward Yahello. Yahello freezes in fear and raises his hand, only for the Kagov to smash him aside. The others notice poison leaking from the strange feather-like appendages on its body and immediately form a defensive formation around Yahello. Chris realizes that their efforts will not work. The Kagov has gone berserk because of the aphrodisiac he gave it. Yahello reassures everyone that they consumed antidotes beforehand, but admits that allowing the fight to continue is still dangerous. He orders everyone to do everything they can to stop the beast. The hunters launch themselves toward the Kagov again. Yahello looks up in terror and closes his eyes as they attack. But instead of being struck, he sees Chris standing in front of him with the holy sword blocking the attack. Chris mocks the House of Tyrann for being so pathetic that they have forced even the flag bearer to step in. He offers to save Yahello if he agrees to call him Big Brother. Yahello calls him crazy and questions why he should agree. Chris asks whether he really does not want his help, reminding him that they do not have all day. The others begin coughing from the poison. Yahello grits his teeth, realizing Chris is right. He finally asks Chris to help, reluctantly calling him a bastard. Chris reminds him to keep his promise. He then smashes the side of the Kagov's head with the holy sword before using his own version of the subjugation arts. Chains of dark energy spread around the Kagov's body and restrain it. Yahello is shocked that Chris can use the technique. Chris asks whether Yahello really thought his family was the only one capable of using it. As long as it is not a secret technique, something as basic as an intermediate subjugation art is nothing special to him. Chris rotates his body and grabs the chains created by his technique, pulling them back like reins before leaping onto the beast's back. The Kagov suddenly screeches and charges forward. Yahello warns Chris to stop because a crevice of Gehenna lies ahead. Chris simply smiles. He already discovered it 18 nights ago and deliberately guides the Kagov straight toward it. The beast begins panicking as it senses the overwhelming malice of Gehenna for the first time. Its bright red eyes suddenly turn yellow as fear takes over. Chris tightens his grip on the dagger and stabs the cag off, killing it instantly. The others rush over and ask whether he is all right, warning that the cave is extremely dangerous and that they need to leave immediately. Chris tells them not to be cowards and asks what they intend to do if the result is only an ash pill instead of a black pill. Yahello becomes frustrated while one of his companions demands to know what Chris plans to do after interfering with the hunt. Yahello stops him and instead thanks Chris for rescuing his subordinates. Because of him, they were able to finish without suffering any major injuries. Chris is surprised that Yahello actually acknowledges it and admits that he feels slightly guilty now, especially knowing that he secretly replaced the black pill. Still, he has to do what he must. He reminds Yahello that he promised to call him Big Brother and asks whether he intends to break his word. Yahello denies ever making such a promise and points out that he is 2 years older than Chris. Suddenly, the entire cave begins shaking. The overwhelming pressure causes several people to collapse. Yahello asks what is happening, but Chris quickly realizes what they are facing. 2 enormous blue eyes appear before them. Chris becomes slightly tense as an unfamiliar voice declares that it has not seen such an interesting plaything in a long time. Chris identifies the creature as a demon from Gehenna. Yahello trembles in fear and urges Chris to run because he is an outsider and should save himself. Chris, however, notices Simon watching from the ceiling. He immediately throws his dagger toward the bat. The weapon pierces it, only for Chris to realize that it is merely Simon's familiar, which he had been using to monitor the situation. As the connection begins breaking apart, Simon is surprised that Chris noticed him. He had intended to watch a little longer before intervening against the demon. However, with the bat familiar destroyed, the one he planned to use for teleportation is gone. Even pushing his blood magic to its limits, it will take him at least 5 minutes to arrive. If he gets there too late, everyone will die. Simon immediately rushes toward the cave. Despite his earlier behavior, he is not actually trying to kill Chris. He simply wanted to play a prank, just as he promised. The demon finds Chris interesting and asks what he is planning. Chris says he simply dislikes people secretly watching him. The demon laughs and comments that Chris has an impressive number of concerns for someone who should already be dead. Chris compares the demon to those he encountered during the Age of Destruction. Against them, this creature would only qualify as a low-ranking demon. Even so, it is at least a 5-star opponent, meaning Chris cannot currently fight it head-on. He raises a finger and decides that the situation is not completely hopeless. Chris casts the same sleep spell he previously used on the girl who was attacked by Lardos and Pomodore. One by one, Yahello's subordinates lose consciousness. Yahello demands to know what Chris is doing when they need to fight together. Chris realizes that Yahello has an unusually strong resistance to magic and strikes him directly in the stomach, telling him to go to sleep already. The demon assumes Chris intends to offer all of them as sacrifices. In exchange, it promises to spare his life and personally bless him. Chris tells it to stop talking and explains that it is his principle never to associate with demons. He begins drawing the holy sword. The demon recognizes it and admits that the idea is admirable, but points out that a holy sword Chris cannot use is nothing more than junk. The demon begins casting a spell, launching it directly at Chris. Chris blocks the attack with the holy sword, but the force is overwhelming. He is blasted backward into the cave wall and loses consciousness. The demon grabs him by the arm and lifts him into the air, offering him another chance to sacrifice the others in exchange for his insignificant life. Chris spits directly in its face and questions why it assumes he cannot use the holy sword. He breaks free, grabs the demon's legs, and uses the momentum to flip himself back onto the ground. Chris then activates his other energy core. The tip of the holy sword begins regenerating as aura flows through it. The demon becomes nervous and questions how a fiend like Chris can wield the power of light. Chris asks whether the demon is finally starting to feel that its life is in danger. The demon insists that this will not stop it and forms a massive red sphere in front of Chris. Chris widens his stance and prepares himself. He unleashes Dead Sea cleaving light, swinging the sword downward and sending an enormous yellow wave toward the demon. The demon is stunned by the attack before being struck. It lets out a scream and collapses. Chris's eyes become extremely tired. He realizes that he has pushed his body far beyond its limits. His vision narrows with every passing second until he finally collapses. As his consciousness fades, he remembers his previous life. Evan asks whether Chris really managed to replicate his ability. Chris says that his version was somewhat similar. Evan is impressed and explains that Dead Sea cleaving light represents a single flash of light capable of dividing the Dead Sea. He finds the name ironic because, despite using the sword technique, Chris failed to become the light of the Mer clan. But Evan believes Chris will become the light that saves the world. Elsewhere, a blue finger touches a puddle. Chris remains barely conscious as a woman observes him with interest. She introduces herself as Mafina, the first seed of Gehenna's 7th realm. Chris's eyes slowly close as Mafina says that she looks forward to seeing what he does in the future. 2 days later, Chris wakes up at the house of Count Tyranne. His head hurts, and he cannot believe he has been lying there for 2 entire days. He considers the time a complete waste, although his body appears to be fine. He looks around and notices the black pill beside him. Chris is relieved to see it, and then remembers Mafina. He considers the attention from a demon unwanted. Sometimes, fiends who stand out early receive a demon's blessing and can be nurtured rapidly, but Chris has no interest in such a thing because blessings from demons are something villains receive. Besides, a demon from the 7th realm is not even that high-ranking by his standards. A large lion-like man enters and asks how Chris is feeling. He is the patriarch of House Tyranne. Chris greets the Count and tries to stand and bow, but the Count tells him to remain seated and rest. Chris wonders what happened. The Count explains that an investigation squad was organized the previous day and examined the cave. They discovered that someone had tampered with the magic circle sealing the entrance to Gehenna. Fortunately, it appears that the demon kin was reverse summoned before things became even worse. Still, even that brief period was more than enough for everyone inside to lose their lives. Chris wonders whether they truly believe the demon was reverse summoned. It makes no sense to assume that he killed it, which means he does not even need to come up with an excuse. The Count then apologizes for how he treated Chris, admitting that he judged him solely based on the rumors that he was a good-for-nothing. He bows and thanks Chris, calling him a benefactor of House Tyranne. Chris insists that there is no need to thank him. As a member of the Dark Magic clan, he simply did what he had to do because they are family. Although he feels somewhat guilty, Chris decides to muddy the situation a little. His words resonate with the Count, who agrees that their families are indeed connected. He offers to help Chris with anything within his ability. Chris considers the offer and makes his request. He wants House Tyranne to let go of its old grudge against House Khazar and end their current relationship of hostility and constant retaliation. Instead, he wants the two branch families to develop a friendly but competitive relationship, allowing them to advance together in a way that reflects their shared bloodline. The Count begins to respond, but Chris points out that he likely understands the real reason their two houses have been feuding. From Chris's perspective, the main family has been manipulating the situation from behind the scenes. If the branch families were to cooperate, the main clan might view their combined influence as a threat. The conflict therefore keeps them divided and reduces them to little more than dogs guarding the main house. The Count asks whether Chris is planning a rebellion against the main clan. Chris immediately denies having any such intention. The Count is surprised that Chris has thought this far ahead. Chris accepts the praise and asks whether the Count will grant his request. The Count sighs and says that for the first time in a while, he should contact Count Khazar. Before finishing, however, he unexpectedly addresses Chris by his name instead. Chris smiles and agrees, saying that if they unite their forces one by one, they can build a much stronger front before the Age of Destruction begins. The Count then asks Yahello what he has been waiting for. Embarrassed, Yahello holds out the ash pill he found on the floor inside the cave. Since Chris showed no signs of waking up, he made sure to keep it safe. Chris jokingly suggests that if Yahello is feeling grateful enough to give him more gifts, he is welcome to do so. Yahello angrily protests, making the Count laugh. Instead, the Count offers Chris a gift himself, a summoning stone capable of storing a rank 4 demon beast. Chris immediately recognizes its rarity. The Count also promises to submit a report supporting Chris's participation in the sacred dark rite, and wishes him good results. Chris thanks him for both the gift and his encouragement. The Count tells him to rest while he and Yahello leave. Chris then calls for someone to come out. A red aura appears behind the curtain as Simon reveals himself. He admits that he suspected Chris's discovery of him was no coincidence, and is impressed that Chris could see through stealth even the Count could not. Chris explains that he simply smelled the scent of blood. Simon introduces himself as the head butler of the Dark Magic clan. Chris wonders whether that means Simon serves the Elder Clan head directly. The name suddenly reminds him of someone from his previous life. Simon is the master of the Blood Shadow Mages, a psychotic organization that never distinguished between the Magic Empire and the Dominion of Light, committing indiscriminate slaughter and terrorism. Its leader was an 8-star fiend who eventually reached 9 stars during the final stage of the Age of Destruction and became the 10th Demon King. Chris remembers how many times he and Evan nearly died because of that man. Simon is also the blood and flesh of the Demon King of Carnage. Simon admits that he never expected the young master to be this impressive, especially after seeing him eliminate a demon. Chris asks whether Simon witnessed Dead Sea cleaving light. Simon immediately realizes that Chris is pretending not to know what he is talking about. After investigating the cave, Simon found the demon's corpse completely annihilated without leaving a trace. That could not have been a reverse summoning. He is impressed and asks Chris to explain what happened, reminding him that everything will eventually be reported to the Elder Clan head. Chris sees no reason to reveal his trump card. Simon reminds him that the Elder Clan head will hear about it anyway. Chris responds that if he were in the Elder Clan head's position, he would not reveal everything so easily. He would hide his claws until the very end instead of answering every question. Simon is surprised by how interesting Chris has become. Chris then asks whether Simon plans to apologize. Simon asks what he has to apologize for. Chris explains that it is normally difficult to distinguish between reverse summoning and complete annihilation based only on traces, which is why the Count believed the demon had been reverse summoned, but Simon clearly knows otherwise. The reason is simple: he was the one who summoned the demon. A demon-kin summoning incident that nearly killed a member of the clan would be extremely serious and could easily reach the elder clan head's ears. Simon admits that Chris is right and promises to take responsibility. Chris decides to keep the matter secret, but tells Simon to remember that he now owes him a major favor. Simon is surprised that Chris is treating this as a deal. Chris says it would be convenient if Simon chose to understand it that way. Simon accepts and promises not to forget Chris's mercy. He says it was a pleasure meeting him, and that he looks forward to seeing him again once Chris arrives at the main clan. Chris understands that Simon will play an important role during the Age of Destruction, so establishing a connection with him is essential if he wants to change the future. Meanwhile, Mary's magic lifts Chris's luggage into the air as she announces that everything is ready for their return. Chris praises her work. Yahello opens the door and asks whether Chris is leaving already. Chris reminds him to use his proper title. Yahello questions what he means, so Chris reminds him that he let it slide in front of the Count, but a promise is a promise. From now on, Yahello has to call him Big Brother. Yahello again points out that he is 2 years older. Chris asks whether he has something else to say. Yahello explains that he came to warn him. After hearing that they were family, he no longer felt right treating Chris this way. He warns Chris to be careful because the person most opposed to his participation in the sacred dark rite is young Lord Loin. Yahello also reminds him that even 2-star fiends from the main family and branch families are not truly on equal footing. The direct descendants have access to superior elixirs, ultimate techniques, and the blessings of dark magic, giving them a much greater starting point. Chris would therefore be easy prey. Chris smiles and offers Yahello a warning of his own, calling him Little Brother. He tells Yahello not to participate in the upcoming sacred dark rite for his own good. Yahello insists that he is only saying this because he is worried, and refuses to let Chris monopolize the pure dark energy. Chris tells him to remember his words. Regardless of who his opponents are, they will regret facing him in the sacred dark rite. Yahello becomes irritated, but Chris ends the conversation and tells Mary that it is time to leave. He tells Yahello to think carefully and make sure he does not regret his decision later. Back at the house of Count Khazar, Chris asks about his brother but learns that he has already left for the training cave. The butler explains that he intends to train alone until the sacred dark rite. Chris eventually catches up with him. Thorn greets him using the full title he was forced to learn, and reminds Chris that he promised to duel him after returning. Chris is surprised by Thorn's rapid growth. In such a short time, he has already reached middle 2-star and is progressing quickly. Thorn says he is busy and needs to continue training. Chris realizes that Thorn is also participating in the sacred dark rite, which complicates things. He tells Thorn to wait and promises they can duel after he finishes training. Chris also urges him to keep training in the meantime. Thorn makes him promise not to postpone their duel again and warns that it cannot end like their previous encounter. Chris agrees and walks away. He remarks that Thorn is a stubborn brat. A girl nearby asks whether he really made the promise, and Chris says that Thorn reminds him of her in many ways. In the training area, Chris sits down and studies the black pill. With half a month remaining before the sacred dark rite, he finally bites into it and immediately complains about the terrible taste. He lies down and begins absorbing the pill through his pathways. The energy is more turbulent than expected. Chris suddenly senses something unusual and realizes that the pill contains traces of light force. Instead, he draws it into his light core while absorbing the dark energy into his dark core simultaneously. Elsewhere, a woman tells someone to enter. A man reports on the investigation she requested. During the black pill hunt, a demonkin was summoned, but Chris survived the incident. The investigation took longer because they also had to investigate the summoning itself. The woman praises his work, and he leaves after confirming that she has no further questions. As she studies a photograph of Chris, we learn that her name is Ideen. Another half-month passes. Someone knocks on Chris's door and announces that today is the promised duel. Chris tells him to enter. Thorn steps inside. Chris is surprised to see him first thing in the morning and jokes that he must be eager to get beaten again. But Chris soon notices how much stronger Thorn's presence has become in just half a month. Thorn dismisses Chris's words and says that his strength has grown considerably. Chris offers to give him the beating he seems to want, but adds one condition. If Thorn loses, he must give up his participation in the upcoming sacred dark rite. Thorn is stunned by the demand. Chris explains that the sacred dark rite is a competition, and weaklings have no place participating. Thorn tells him to stop talking and draw his sword. Chris realizes that Thorn is too blind to understand his brotherly concern, so he decides to knock the lesson into his head personally. He launches forward. The scene then cuts to the infirmary. Thorn has been completely beaten and is now unconscious. Raiden is told that Chris went too far, and that the healer expects Thorn to remain on bed rest for half a month. Raiden concludes that they will have to wait until the next sacred dark rite. When someone begins arguing against the decision, Chris asks to speak with his father alone. His father agrees and leaves them alone to talk things out. Chris approaches Thorn's bed and asks why he is sulking when he was the one who demanded the duel. He then points out that Thorn seems to resent seeing him grow stronger and has deliberately injured him so he cannot participate in the sacred dark rite. Chris explains that this was never his intention. He pushed Thorn because he wanted him to become stronger. If they competed in the rite, Thorn would permanently lose his chance to obtain the pure dark energy, so Chris had to be rough because of how stubborn he is. More importantly, Chris explains that pure dark energy is simply not suited to Thorn. Thorn asks what he means. Chris explains that, just as the power of light has different attributes, dark energy also comes in various forms. Pure dark energy is the highest attribute, while gray dark energy ranks directly below it and is particularly suited to curse magic. Chris points out that Thorn seems to have an easier time mastering curse magic than swordsmanship. Thorn wonders how Chris knows this. Chris cannot exactly tell him that he learned it from the future, so he simply says that he figured it out while sparring with him. He then warns Thorn that absorbing pure dark energy before mastering gray dark energy could cause problems later. Although it would not make mastering gray dark energy impossible, the unique properties of pure dark energy could interfere with his progress and slow him down. Chris wants Thorn to become as strong as possible as quickly as possible, so he urges him to think carefully before participating in the rite. This is his sincere advice as an older brother who genuinely wants his younger brother to grow. Thorn is deeply moved. Chris then gives him an ash pill. Thorn recognizes its value and asks why Chris would give something so precious to him. Chris simply says it is because he is his little brother, and adds that he has already consumed something far better anyway. Thorn begins tearing up. He cannot understand how Chris could change so much, and wonders why he behaved like such a terrible person before, even when their mother was on her deathbed. He realizes how much pain his actions caused her. Chris looks at him before sitting beside his bed. He admits that he simply did not understand those things back then. Later, the carriage finally stops. Chris steps out and stretches, complaining about how sore his body feels after traveling so far. He wonders why they could not simply use a warp gate and calls their refusal petty, saying things will change once he becomes clan head. Mary suddenly flies over, excited that the two of them are going on a trip together, and joking that it is making her heart race. Chris reminds her that she does not even have a heart. Because the main family limited him to bringing only one companion, he could only bring Mary since their contract binds her to him. As they walk, Chris notices people talking about them. Mary points out that he is already famous. Simon soon approaches and respectfully addresses Chris as the young master. Everyone nearby is surprised to see the Dark Magic clan's head butler greeting someone like Chris. Simon remarks that Chris has grown considerably in only half a month. Chris asks whether the Elder Clan head really has nothing better to do. Simon explains that he is here specifically on the Elder Clan head's orders. The Elder Clan head wants to meet Chris personally. Simon notices that Chris does not seem surprised and asks whether he expected this. Chris says he was actually surprised, though Simon clearly does not believe him. They arrive at the clan head's room, where Simon announces that he has brought Chris. The Duke welcomes him and says it has been a while. Marion is also present. Chris immediately feels an overwhelming presence. The Duke's gaze alone carries enough pressure to make it difficult for Chris to stand. Despite knowing that someone of Chris's level cannot withstand such dark energy, the Duke does not bother suppressing it. Chris's hands tremble as he lowers his head and respectfully greets the Duke. The Duke asks whether Chris was surprised by the sudden meeting. Chris says he expected the Duke to call for him eventually because a new star has appeared within the clan. The Duke laughs and confirms that he is correct. Both Marion and Simon have already spoken highly of Chris. Yet the Duke remains uncertain about whether he should place expectations on him. He explains that no matter how promising a seed may be, only time will reveal what it becomes. It could grow into a great tree, or it could wither soon after emerging. Chris agrees that he is still too lacking to meet the Duke's expectations. However, he adds that only time will determine whether the sapling eventually grows into a great tree or becomes something abnormal enough to cast its own shadow over one. Regardless, Chris assures him that he will not disappoint him. The Duke laughs again and says that he will look forward to Chris's growth before dismissing him. After Chris leaves, Marion asks what the Duke thinks of him. The Duke admits that Chris exceeded his expectations. However, possessing such extraordinary talent means his future will be far more turbulent. Marion already knows that the bloody winds approaching the Magic Empire will soon reach them. Still, the Duke does not consider this entirely bad news. A small hope has sprouted today. Marion is surprised. The Duke says that Chris may truly be capable of fulfilling his long-desired wish. The eve of the sacred dark rite arrives. The guests announce the arrival of Count Khazar's eldest son, Christian. Chris enters looking exceptionally well-dressed. The guests wonder why the Duke would personally meet someone they once considered a fool and comment on his appearance. Chris confidently assumes they are admiring how handsome he is, while Mary enthusiastically agrees. He then spots alcohol and immediately heads toward it. The waitress stops him because he is underage and offers him ginger ale instead. The guests laugh. Chris cannot believe they are treating him this way and insists that he wants alcohol, not ginger ale. The announcements continue as the young lords and young ladies enter. The doors open, revealing the recognized successors. Escott, the second young lord, enters alongside Juliana, the first young lady. Jen, the second young lady, and Miss, the third young lord, also appear. Only 4 of the 5 recognized successors are present. Chris notices that the first young lord is absent. He wonders what Escott will say to him after being caught in Chris's earlier trap. To Chris's surprise, Escott simply walks past without saying anything. Chris is irritated that Escott will not even look him in the eye after everything he has done, concluding that he may be no better than Chris himself. Juliana, however, lifts her skirt slightly and gives Chris a polite greeting. Chris recognizes her and remembers Marion's warning to be careful around her. Yet he senses nothing unusual. He decides to figure it out later. For now, this is enough reconnaissance. He intends to return and prepare for the sacred dark rite. Before he can leave, a butler approaches and introduces himself as Flower, a summoner serving young Master Loin. Chris asks why that concerns him. Flower explains that he heard an unworthy person will participate in tomorrow's sacred dark rite. He claims an underqualified participant could cause an accident and stain the reputation of the great dark magic clan. Chris realizes that Flower is talking about him. Flower insists that Chris simply needs to prove otherwise. Chris looks toward the upper floors and spots Loin glaring down at him. Chris tells him that if he dislikes him, he should come down himself and settle it during the rite. Loin accepts, saying it will not inconvenience him. Chris says he would like to see what tricks Loin can perform. Flower suggests they fight immediately, but Chris points out that he is unarmed. Flower expects Chris to use a weapon, but Chris refuses to arm himself against someone he considers nothing more than a rat. Flower warns that Chris will regret his arrogance. Chris calmly replies that he thinks Flower will be the one regretting it. Chan and Juliana watch the exchange closely, particularly Juliana. The surrounding guests suddenly react with surprise. Flower is being overwhelmed by a swarm of spirits, while other spirits feed Chris grapes and attend to him like royalty. Chris simply sits there, completely unfazed by the spectacle. The guests are stunned by what they are witnessing. Flower had summoned the evil spirits himself, yet with a single gesture, Chris somehow turned them against their own master. Everyone wonders how he gained control of them so quickly. Chris asks whether this was young Master Loin's doing. He says such behavior is unbecoming of a direct heir of the dark magic clan and that, if Loin had a grievance, he should have challenged him openly. Loin denies having anything to do with the incident. Chris says nobody would believe such an obvious lie, but he decides to let it go this once. They can settle things during the sacred dark rite, where Chris intends to teach Loin some manners for his cowardice. The next day, the sacred dark rite begins. Chris arrives yawning and looking completely uninterested. Aloe asks whether he is not even slightly nervous after causing such a scene the previous day. Chris instead questions why Aloe came when he had already warned him not to participate. He calls him little brother, while Aloe angrily asks how Chris could postpone the rite after everything he has done and calls him crazy. Loin then descends the stairs, glaring at everyone as though he is above them. Before anything else can happen, an elderly voice asks whether everyone is gathered. The man introduces himself as Sebastian, the vice butler overseeing the main house. He announces that he will now lead them to the sacred ground where the rite will take place. Sebastian taps the floor with his staff, producing strange, shifting colors. Stairs suddenly appear beneath everyone. Chris recognizes that it is not a real staircase but an illusionary technique that materializes an imaginary space. Sebastian begins descending at an incredible pace, leaving the others struggling to keep up. They cling to the path and follow every turn, confused because they believed they were heading underground. Instead, the path continues downward at an impossible slope. Even Loin and Aloe struggle to keep their balance. Sebastian urges them to hurry, warning that the ground will not support them forever. Several participants lose their footing and fall into the surrounding void. Since they are already behind schedule, Sebastian increases his speed even further. More participants fall away. Loin dismisses them as losers who should know their place, but he is sweating heavily himself. Then he notices Chris effortlessly gliding past him without showing the slightest sign of exhaustion. Chris asks whether Loin is already out of breath, and mocks him for being all bark and no bite despite being a direct heir who should have received the best potions. Chris explains that running seriously through an illusionary space is pointless because it does not actually drain his stamina. With a slight adjustment to the spell, he can effectively become invincible within this realm. Sebastian is impressed and realizes that Chris must be young Master Christian. Eventually, they reach the sacred ground. The surviving participants are exhausted and gasping for breath, while Chris remains completely unharmed. Aloe asks how Chris can possibly be unaffected. Chris tells him that this is why he should have trained his body instead of wasting his time elsewhere. Another voice welcomes everyone. A crystal appears and floats through the room. The woman introduces herself as Rahu, the manager of the sacred ground. She explains that this place contains the purest form of dark energy known as the sacred darkness. Today, the young masters and young misses will compete to obtain this power, the same great darkness once pursued by the third-ranked demon king, the Dark Destroyer, progenitor of the dark magic clan. A blue light spreads across the ground beneath them. Rahu explains that there is not enough sacred darkness for everyone. The demon beasts within the sacred ground will test their worthiness, meaning the participants must compete to reach the darkness first. Chris immediately asks whether the winner is simply whoever arrives first. Rahu praises his insight. Chris then asks what happens if an unexpected situation causes competitors to encounter one another and fight. Rahu explains that each participant will follow a separate path, so such encounters should not happen. Even if they do, they should avoid fighting because wasting time only benefits the other competitors. She tells everyone to prioritize their own safety and wishes them good fortune. The countdown ends, and everyone rushes down their respective paths. Sebastian and Rahu remain behind. Sebastian jokingly suggests betting some blood juice on the winner, but Rahu disappears without answering. Sebastian complains that he has been ignored again. Meanwhile, Loin advances through his tunnel and encounters a swarm of beasts. The creatures attack with flames pouring from their mouths. Loin coats his hand with aura and strikes one directly in the throat before moving rapidly from beast to beast, eliminating them all. He judges them to be lower second-tier magical creatures, nothing worth worrying about for an upper 2-star fiend. Loin assumes Chris must be struggling badly. According to the rules, every path should have the same difficulty, distance, and time. However, Loin secretly bribed a mage to make Chris's path far more dangerous, ensuring that stronger demon beasts would attack him. Any deaths during the rite are overlooked, so Loin intends for Chris's path to become his grave. Eventually, Loin reaches a door and assumes it must lead to the sacred ground. Before he can celebrate, Chris asks what took him so long because he was nearly dying of boredom waiting. Loin is stunned by how Chris arrived so quickly. Chris says there was nothing difficult about his path. Loin insists that this is impossible because Chris should have faced much stronger monsters. He suddenly realizes that he has revealed too much. Chris smiles as he connects the pieces. He now understands that Loin was responsible for altering his path. Loin demands to know who Chris thinks he is to make such accusations. Chris points out that they are alone for the moment and asks whether there is any need for formalities. Loin insults him and reminds him that fighting between competitors is taboo during the rite. Nevertheless, he decides to crush Chris right there. Loin launches a magic combat technique designed for close-range attacks, using explosive magic power to damage opponents and disable their joints. Chris easily avoids every strike. Loin becomes increasingly frustrated and calls him a slippery rat. Eventually, Loin notices what he believes is an opening in Chris's hand and charges forward, intending to break him. Chris calls him a fool and catches his wrist instead. He locks Loin's arm into a joint hold and calmly tells him not to cry when it hurts. A sharp crack echoes through the chamber. Loin screams. Yahello soon arrives, asking whether he is too late, only to find Loin and another competitor lying on the floor. He asks whether Chris did this. Chris calls Yahello painfully slow and asks whether he intends to faint on his own or needs another beating. Yahello insists that he has not been sitting around doing nothing and challenges Chris. Chris immediately defeats him again. He calls the situation familiar and assumes someone will eventually come looking for them if he simply leaves them there. Chris then focuses on the reason he came. 5 years from now, the first great war against the Alliance will begin. Before then, he must bring the entire dark magic clan under his control. That means he cannot afford to share even a fraction of the sacred darkness with anyone else. With the obstacles removed, Chris finally approaches the sacred darkness. This power gives fiends the possibility of becoming true transcendent beings. The Duke, who absorbed roughly 80% of it, became one of the strongest beings alive, even among the demon monarchs. The Dark Destroyer absorbed more than 90% and became a demon king. Chris realizes that if he could somehow absorb 100% of the sacred darkness, he might even surpass the demon emperor. He slowly extends his hand. The sacred darkness begins flowing into him through every pathway. Elsewhere, the observers are stunned. Every participant except Chris has been eliminated, and young Master Loin is in critical condition. Some suspect Chris used a trick or a forbidden magic tool and insist that the incident must be thoroughly investigated and punished. Jen dismisses the concern. She explains that Chris has not emerged from the sacred ground for 2 days. Unless absorbing such an enormous amount of sacred darkness simply requires that much time, he has already been crushed by its power and died. Even the Duke eventually reached his limit in how much sacred darkness he could absorb. There should not even be a corpse left behind. Jen leaves the room and closes the door behind her. She is furious. Even if Chris somehow returns alive, she intends to kill him herself. Her father died during his battle against the Alliance, leaving only her and Loin to be adopted by their uncle, Viscount Langham. Because of that, her position within the clan is already unstable. Now that Loin has failed to obtain the sacred darkness as well, He has little chance of gaining support in the succession struggle. Jen blames Chris for this humiliation and vows to make him pay for it. Some of the clan members continue mocking Chris for remaining inside the sacred ground, assuming he must already be dead, and that his greed brought this punishment upon him. They even mock Mary, saying she will soon be waiting for her master's ghost. Mary quietly tears a hole through one of their bags as a warning. She sweetly says that she is patiently waiting for her young master, but if they keep making noise around her, she will turn them into ghosts under her control. The frightened men immediately apologize and run away. Mary returns to her cheerful demeanor and urges Chris to come back soon, saying that keeping a maiden waiting is not gentlemanly. Meanwhile, Chris is struggling inside the sacred ground. The endless darkness presses against him and makes it difficult to breathe. He has absorbed around 70% of the sacred darkness, but the process is far more difficult than expected. He knows the real danger begins around 90%. If he absorbs too much, his core will shatter and he will die here before the war even begins. Then he realizes something. Dragons possess enormous cores capable of storing tremendous amounts of energy. If he could temporarily imitate a dragon's heart, even for a few minutes, he might be able to contain the sacred darkness. He attempts to do exactly that. More energy begins entering him, but his core starts showing signs of breaking apart. Chris realizes he has reached his limit and prepares to stop. Mafina suddenly appears before him and asks whether he wants her help. Chris is startled that a demon can appear inside this space. Mafina explains that demons can communicate through darkness, so entering this place is not difficult for her. More importantly, she can help him absorb all of the sacred darkness without asking for anything in return. Chris asks why she would do that. Mafina simply laughs and extends her hand, telling him that he only needs to take it and she can help him absorb everything. 1 week later, the Duke sets down his cup. With no news from Chris, he admits that it is difficult to believe the boy is still alive. Marion wonders why Chris would push his greed this far. Simon explains that Count Langham shares the same opinion and wants to close the passage leading to the sacred ground. The Duke considers the matter and asks Simon whether he should give the order. He then admits that he is only testing the old man and asks Simon whether he believes the reckless child is still alive. Simon says the odds are almost zero, but Chris is too interesting for him to say that with certainty. The Duke thinks for a moment before deciding to leave the passage open for one more day. Marion sighs with relief, while Simon leaves to spread the order. Inside the sacred ground, Chris's pathways are overflowing with pure dark energy. His heart aches, and his core feels as though it could explode at any moment. Mafina again tells him to take her hand before it is too late. Chris stubbornly refuses. Mafina calls him foolish and reminds him that humans are not meant to cross certain limits. Chris becomes irritated. He suddenly remembers that this place is a world governed by concepts, and that gives him another possibility. Chris's hair turns gray, his eyes become red, and red horns emerge from his head. He has activated demonization. Mafina is shocked. Demonization is the Mystic Clan's ultimate technique, a forbidden spell that temporarily transforms a mortal into a demon and grants explosive power. However, it is extremely dangerous and can kill the user. Lena once died after using it. Chris realizes that if he removes the portions of the technique designed to amplify dark energy, he can instead use the world's own dark energy without suffering the usual penalties. He begins forming a container and gathers the surrounding energy inside it. The method works. He can now absorb more than 90% of the sacred darkness and potentially claim all of it for himself. Mafina is stunned when Chris forms a black crescent. She cannot believe that an ordinary mortal has managed to shed his human limitations. Chris simply attributes it to his genius. As he leaves the space, he tells Mafina to continue living her life while he takes his leave. Mafina says that she will see him again someday. Chris turns around just before the portal closes and raises his middle finger at her. Mafina remains silent for a moment before understanding the gesture and bursting into laughter. Chris curses her as he leaves, insisting that he would be crazy to ever meet that troublesome demon again. He then wonders how much time has passed. He estimates that about a week has gone by, meaning the clan must already be in chaos. Chris dispels demonization and decides that it is time to play another prank. Not long afterward, a butler rushes into the Lord's office and announces that Chris has returned. Everyone is shocked that he is still alive. The acting clan head orders the butler to explain. He reports that Chris survived with his life barely intact and is suffering from extreme exhaustion. According to the healer, Chris's core is sensing an enormous amount of pure dark energy, but the energy is in complete disorder, making it difficult for him to use. One of the clan members curses Chris and claims that someone like him could never have absorbed more than 80% of the sacred darkness. Another demands that Chris take responsibility for wasting such a precious resource. The acting head coldly tells them that he will take note of the matter and dismisses everyone. Once they leave, he asks another man whether the report is accurate. The man confirms that he observed Chris with a healer and that something is clearly wrong with his core. The acting head continues tapping his fingers against the table. He explains that Loin was supposed to become the young lord, serving as the sacrificial lamb and a key part of their plans involving the Poison Magic clan. Their larger eradication plan involving Jupion has now been postponed. As for Chris, his existence is becoming troublesome, especially because his father is beginning to pay attention to him and his rise is disrupting the balance they carefully established. After more silence and tapping, the acting head orders them to bring Chris to the Darkness Hall the following day. There, he will publicly announce Chris's punishment before the clan's vassals. The next day, Chris is summoned to the Darkness Hall. He immediately realizes that they are desperately trying to eliminate him, especially since so many important figures have gathered. The acting head asks whether Chris is aware of the sins he committed during the sacred dark rite. Chris calmly confirms that he is. The acting head then asks him to explain himself. Chris says that his fellow participants were unworthy of their lineage, so perhaps he should have beaten them even more thoroughly. One of the women present becomes furious. The acting head explains the real accusation. Chris monopolized a precious resource of the Dark Magic clan but failed to produce a result worthy of receiving it. Chris asks how they determined that. He is told that 70% purity is the minimum standard. Chris asks what punishment awaits someone who fails to reach 70%. The acting head explains that such a person would be denied access to the Dark Magic clan's inheritance of dark magic techniques. They would also be permanently barred from the main family's grounds and denied succession to the house of Count Khazar. Chris remains unconcerned and points out that even they cannot properly measure the purity of his dark energy in its current state. At that moment, Eskit raises his hand and offers a solution. Although Chris's core is currently unstable, Eskit suggests using a dark energy clash to determine his purity. A dark energy clash is a battle designed specifically to compare the purity of two people's dark energy. When the amount of energy is equal, the one with greater purity overwhelms the other. Even among energy of similar rank, the pure energy will eventually prevail. Chris realizes that this is a perfect opportunity for them to destroy his core. He also realizes that Eskit is more sinister than he expected. Before the clash begins, Chris establishes a condition. If he produces a sufficiently impressive result, the clan must support him and allow him to attempt the young lord's trial. Several people are shocked by the demand. His brother agrees, pointing out that there is no rule preventing someone from a branch family from pursuing the position of young lord. In the Magic Empire, strength determines who stands above the weak. Chris steps onto the stage. His opponent warns him that a dark energy clash can damage the core if the user lacks sufficient control. To keep things fair according to their ranks, he will only use dark energy at the beginner 2-star level. As they begin releasing their energy, Chris tells his opponent not to bother holding back and to worry about protecting his precious core. The man releases his dark energy, saying that Chris's confidence has made him look forward to this. The moment their energies collide, Chris completely overwhelms his opponent's beginner 2-star dark energy without even gathering any strength of his own. The man is stunned. He immediately increases his output to expert 2-star dark energy, but the result remains the same. Chris looks disappointed and mocks him for acting so arrogant despite being this weak. The taunt enrages him, and he releases a massive amount of aura. The spectators immediately recognize it as 4-star dark energy and realize that a direct hit would shatter Chris's core. A dragon-shaped mass of energy forms around Chris. In response, his opponent creates an enormous dark claw, so large that the dragon looks like an insect beside it. Chris calmly reminds him that a dark energy clash can damage one's core if they lack sufficient control, so he should be careful. The attack tears into his opponent's core, causing him to cough up blood. Chris withdraws his energy, disappointed that the attack was not enough to completely shatter his opponent's core. The man, however, realizes the truth and announces that Chris's dark energy has at least 90% purity. Everyone is shocked. Chris turns toward the acting head and declares that he has now proven himself worthy of becoming a young lord. The acting head remains expressionless, continuing to tap his fingers against the table. As promised, he agrees to let Chris attempt the young lord's trial. However, no member of a branch family has ever taken the test before, so as acting head, he will personally select Chris's trial. Chris immediately realizes that this means he intends to give him an impossible challenge. His qualifications will be judged in 2 stages. First, he must prove his talent. Then, he must accomplish a feat worthy of a young lord. Chris asks how he is expected to prove his talent. The acting head tells him to reach 3 stars within 3 months. Chris remains calm and asks if that's all, saying that as a genius he should be able to accomplish it. The acting head says nothing more and simply looks forward to seeing what Chris achieves over the next 3 months. Later, the acting head sits across from Eskit in a quiet room while drinking tea. He admits that underestimating Chris was his mistake, especially since the dark energy clash even damaged his own core. They need to deal with Chris quickly before he becomes an even greater problem. The younger man tells him not to worry. He reminds him why they deliberately avoid absorbing more than 70% of the sacred darkness. The higher the purity of the absorbed dark energy, the harder it becomes to increase its rank. The difficulty rises exponentially. Reaching even 3 stars would take someone who absorbed 90% several times longer than it would take others. No matter how talented Chris is, he will eventually hit that wall. Meanwhile, Mary serves Chris a meal and tells him that news of his performance has spread throughout the mansion. She proudly tells him that he has made her happy, and admits that waiting for him has made her realize how she truly feels. Every day he was gone felt like an eternity to her. Chris is embarrassed by her honesty. Her words remind him of his previous life. He remembers the fox girl worrying about him and the saint assuring her that his agility would keep him safe. He also remembers how they had both shown genuine concern for him. After surviving a life filled with bloodshed and people who wished for his death, Chris realizes that he has finally encountered people whose hearts are filled with warmth. As Mary prepares his blood juice, Chris finally tells her what he could not say before. He is grateful that she waited for him. Mary becomes shy, delighted that he has finally understood her feelings. Chris reminds her that she does not even have a heart. Mary jokingly replies that her heart was stolen by him. Since she waited for him, Chris decides to reward her by taking her for a walk. Mary becomes ecstatic and immediately dresses up. As they walk through the garden, Chris thinks that relaxing once in a while is not bad. However, he still has to reach 3 stars within 3 months. Even with the guidance of the Branch family's tutors, controlling more than 90% pure darkness by himself will be extremely difficult. A voice interrupts his thoughts. Chris turns around and finds his aunt. She asks whether this is really the time for him to leisurely wander around the garden, and whether he has found someone to assist with his training. Chris asks if she intends to teach him herself. She tells him that she does not. Instead, she has found someone else. Chris sends Mary away, telling her that he will see her at dinner. As they descend the stairs, Chris thanks his aunt for thinking about her nephew despite not knowing who his teacher is. She tells him he should not thank her yet. He will understand once he meets the teacher. The man's teaching methods are harsh, and not even her siblings could keep up with his training. She warns Chris that an opportunity like this will not come often, so he must not disappoint him. When they reach the bottom, Chris spots a child standing there. He wonders whether the boy is lost, and seeing how young he looks, casually pats him on the head and asks where his parents are. The boy's expression immediately makes Chris realize his mistake. His aunt tells him to show some respect and greet him properly. This child is the incarnation of the clan head. Chris straightens up and greets him. Dark energy begins radiating from Chris, and the clan head is surprised to discover that he has absorbed more than 90% of the sacred darkness. He acknowledges that Chris has accomplished something remarkable, but tells him that absorbing so much was still a foolish decision. Chris does not disagree. The clan head explains that even he, having absorbed 80% of the sacred darkness, encountered walls far higher than those faced by ordinary fiends. Even their progenitor could not have reached his current level without the blessing bestowed by the demon emperor. He cannot imagine how difficult Chris's future path will become. Because of that, he offers to return some of Chris's dark energy to the ether. With Chris's talent, 80% would already be more than enough. Anything beyond that is simply greed. Before he can finish, Chris asks him why the dark magic clan has become so weak. His aunt immediately becomes alert. Chris explains that although the dark magic clan is not on the level of the mystic magic clan or undead magic clan, the two clans regarded as the heaven above the heavens, it is still considered the weakest among the 12 noble clans. He says the Dark Magic clan has prospered greatly compared with previous generations, largely because of the clan head's achievements. Yet other fiends still say the clan is no longer what it once was. Chris believes there is only one reason: they lack enough absolute stage individuals above 8 stars. The clan head remains silent. Chris knows what will happen in the future. When the Demon King of Carnage attacks the Dark Magic clan, Nordian will already be dead. Only a handful of 7-star fiends and no 8-star fiends will remain. Together with the clan's 10,000 soldiers, they will fight the Demon King. They will lose and eventually be forced into slavery. That is why absolute stage combatants of 8 stars and above are so important to the clan. Chris knows the Elder Clan head must already be worried about this. The clan head agrees that Chris understands the situation well, but he remains concerned that the weight of such immense pure dark energy will crush Chris and prevent him from growing. Chris asks whether he is truly satisfied with simply strengthening the clan. Perhaps Chris can overcome these obstacles and become a being of limitless power who rises above everything. The clan head laughs, admitting that Chris certainly knows how to speak. He tells Chris that he will not regret his decision. Dark energy suddenly forms beneath Chris's feet, engulfing him within seconds. When Chris awakens, he finds himself in a forest. A voice tells him that his first task is to inherit the pure dark energy. Chris is confused. The voice simply tells him to survive. Behind him, a hungry 2-headed bear appears. Chris immediately senses the danger. Elsewhere, the clan head observes him through a magical sphere. Chris's aunt realizes that this is a trial and questions whether throwing a 2-star child into a 4-star magic beast's territory is truly appropriate. The clan head responds by summoning another rock lizard. Marion apologizes to her nephew, admitting that her words have made the trial even harder. The clan head explains that as Chris continues struggling to survive, he will eventually encounter the true nature of pure dark energy. Understanding comes fastest and deepest when someone is pushed to the brink of death, though he hopes Chris does not get seriously hurt. Sitting on a couch, the clan head asks Marion if she has prepared the snacks. She reveals a box full of sweets, which he immediately starts eating. He wonders why using dark energy always makes him crave sweets. He then turns off the lights, explaining that watching the results in complete darkness is much better, and excitedly settles in to observe his grandson. Meanwhile, Chris faces both a 2-headed bear and a rock lizard. One direct hit from either could kill him. The lizard spits poison, and Chris barely avoids it as the venom melts through a tree in seconds. Still, Chris considers this nothing more than a training assignment. He calls out to the clan head asking whether he is listening. Since there is no response, Chris assumes the only answer he will receive is defeating monsters far stronger than himself. His aunt quietly thinks that the clan head simply wants to watch him get beaten around, but Chris confidently prepares to defeat them in one blow. The bear charges. Chris immediately recognizes that its speed and strength are overwhelming and dodges the attack while searching for a weakness. From the observation sphere, the clan head praises his talent, noting that Chris's movements are unlike those of ordinary children. Marion agrees that his skills are impressive, but reminds him that Chris is still just a child. Before either of them can say more, Chris has already defeated the bear, leaving them stunned. The clan head asks how he managed it so easily. Chris explains that although the bear possesses tremendous physical strength and defense, its agility and magic resistance are comparatively weak. He exploited that weakness and injected dark energy directly into its heart at the right moment. Marion is shocked by the technique, but before she can finish speaking, the clan head identifies it as Dark Death, one of his favorite techniques. Chris then realizes that he has not dealt with the rock lizard yet. The creature immediately attacks, but Chris dodges its strike. The second head follows with another stream of poison, forcing him to evade again. Chris realizes that the lizard has 3 hearts and will continue regenerating unless all 3 are destroyed simultaneously. He changes his approach, forming dark energy into ropes that wrap around the creature and completely restrict its movement. He then pulls with tremendous force, destroying the entire monster and shattering all 3 hearts at once. The clan head identifies the technique as an applied version of dark destruction. He complains that he cannot see properly and asks Marion to move aside. Then he wonders whether she taught Chris the technique. Marion immediately denies it, insisting that she has no idea how he learned it. The clan head remarks that such techniques are not normally something that can simply be learned, while another voice suggests that if everything had to be taught, there would be no need to learn dark magic at all. The clan head remains silent. With the trial complete, Chris is transported back to reality. He admits that he had to think carefully during the trial, but considers it a valuable lesson, giving the clan head credit for creating the situation. Marion and the clan head remain quiet. Chris explains that thanks to the clan head, he has learned how to apply dark magic on his own. He has no intention of becoming arrogant, but now he is ready to begin full-scale dark magic training. He orders the others to leave and they follow. Marion worries that the clan head may be pushing Chris too hard. Before the first magic transfer, the clan head asks Chris what he thinks dark magic is. Chris answers that it is the power to dominate an opponent through perfect darkness. The clan head asks what he means by perfect darkness, leaving Chris without an answer. Instead of explaining, the clan head tells Chris to watch carefully and unlocks a mysterious seal. The entire area begins shaking as dark energy surrounds them. He explains that this is the beginning of all darkness. If Chris descends the deep stairs, the 12 abysses will await him, where he must devour the Lord shrouded in darkness. A massive amount of energy gathers before the clan head's hand, forming a dagger made from pure darkness. He swings it once. Chris feels the attack despite the distance. It represents death itself, and a single strike could kill him. The space behind him is split apart, and he struggles to breathe after realizing the blade passed directly across his neck. The clan head explains that it is a sword of ideas, one that cuts only what its wielder intends to cut. The sword disappears. Before leaving, the clan head gives Chris 1 month to sharpen the black sword he has just witnessed, without explaining how he is supposed to accomplish it. Chris is left confused. The next morning, he begins an intense training routine, running around the training grounds before performing one-handed push-ups. His body becomes drenched in sweat, and he removes his shirt, revealing a far more defined back. But that image is only a dream. In reality, Chris still has a long way to go and remains thin. He sits down to meditate and reminds himself to return to training. Pure dark energy forms around his hands and takes the shape of a dagger, but the attempt quickly fails. Chris is frustrated after losing count of how many times he has failed. Even when he successfully manifests the dagger, it lasts for no more than 10 seconds, and it is nowhere near as powerful as the clan head's black sword. That sword had felt far more primal, as though it represented darkness itself. Chris recalls the clan head's words about climbing the deep stairs and facing the 12 abysses, along with the mysterious phrase about seeking and praising wisdom. He concludes that there must be a hidden meaning within the incantation. Exactly 1 month later, Marion and the clan head descend toward the training grounds. The clan head assumes Chris should have failed enough times by now to understand his limits. He asks Marion if she is still worried about him. She explains that there must be a faster method because only about 2 months remain before the successor test. The clan head reminds her that with the purity of the dark energy Chris absorbed, rapid growth is nearly impossible. Even if he forces his progress, he will eventually hit an enormous wall. For now, strengthening his foundation is the better choice. When they arrive, they are shocked to see Chris already manifesting a black dagger. Chris tells the clan head that he figured it was time for him to return. He credits the clan head for helping him reach 3 stars faster than expected. Before he can finish, the sword disappears. Chris admits that maintaining it is still beyond him, and that what he can currently produce is little more than an imitation. He explains that it took him about a week to manifest the black sword, but it felt incomplete. He believes the 12 abysses mentioned earlier refer to the sword containing all 12 attributes of mana. The clan head is stunned. Chris has not only exceeded his expectations, but has understood the true purpose of the task. According to the clan head, most people need an entire year just to manifest a basic black sword, while a lifetime may not be enough to comprehend all 12 types of mana and awaken the true black sword. Chris has accomplished all of this in less than a month. The clan head begins to see him as the only hope that may emerge from the cursed demonic path. He tells Chris to prepare himself because starting tomorrow, his training will become far more difficult. Chris remains confident and says he trusts the clan head. Having cleared the first hurdle, he decides he deserves a drink. He heads to the winery, acting excited as he moves around the place, and chooses an expensive liquor he could never have afforded in his previous life. He decides to drink it before Mary can find him and take it away. A voice calls out to him. Chris turns and sees a beautiful 3-star demon. He immediately notices that her eye colors suggest she is not from the dark magic clan. When he asks whether she knows him, both she and her attendant are stunned. She becomes furious at his response and strikes him with mana, knocking him to the ground. Her attendant tells her to leave him alone and says there is no reason to associate with someone like Chris. As she turns away, the clan head from the trial arrives and takes the wine bottle from Chris. Chris angrily demands to know who the woman is. The clan head explains that she is Princess Marissa of the Venom clan. Chris immediately realizes the problem. Marissa may be his fiancée, or more accurately, his former fiancée. Chris is now in a difficult position, realizing that his actions may have just caused another problem. Meanwhile, Marissa walks through the corridor, visibly furious. In a flashback, 8-year-old Marissa is playing with ants, wondering why her father brought her to the dark magic clan when everyone only wants to talk to her brother. Nearby, the adults gossip about her, calling her an illegitimate child and questioning whether the Duke has lost his mind. Since his son is useless, they assume he is trying to marry his daughter into another family to secure a capable successor. Feeling someone nearby, Marissa looks up and sees Chris. He asks why a child is wandering around alone. It is the first time Marissa has seen him, and she is immediately charmed by his appearance. She corrects him, saying that she is not a child but Marissa. Chris calls her by name and introduces himself as Christian von Baron Khazar. Marissa realizes he is the son of Count Khazar. Chris tells her not to worry about what the adults say and suggests that she pay them back when she grows stronger. Marissa initially hesitates, but then declares that she will become the strongest demon and crush everyone who looks down on her. Even the original Chris is impressed by her ambition. Marissa is surprised by his encouragement, but Chris stands up and decides that if she truly intends to become the strongest, he should stay on her good side. He offers his hand and calls her the future strongest demon lady, asking her to show him around the dark magic clan estate. Marissa's face turns bright red. Back in the present, she tries to push those memories away. Their engagement was arranged to maintain peace between the two families, but she once dreamed about the future they might have together. Now that version of herself is gone. Rumors about Chris's terrible behavior have reached her for years, and she has long since stopped believing in the person she once admired. With tears in her eyes, Marissa arrives at the Patriarch's office. The Patriarch welcomes her and asks why she has come. She explains that a relic has appeared in the neutral zone between their two families. She asks what the Dark Magic clan intends to do, especially since the Venom clan claimed the previous relic. The Patriarch asks whether the Venom clan intends to surrender this time. Marissa says they do not, and asks whether he would do the same if their positions were reversed. He understands that she wants a fair competition. Marissa proposes that each family send an exploration team, with whichever side finds the relic first keeping it. To prevent direct conflict, each team will be limited to 10 demons at 3 stars or below. She explains that heavy losses would only benefit their enemies, especially with the current instability in the Four Kings domain. The patriarch taps the table before accepting her terms. Marissa finds his quick agreement suspicious. He adds one condition. If the Venom clan violates the agreement, the Dark Magic clan will claim both the new relic and the one the Venom clan took previously. When Marissa asks what would constitute a violation, he mentions underhanded tactics such as sabotaging or ambushing the opposing team. Since traps and ambushes are the Venom clan's specialty, Marissa understands exactly what he means. With a serious expression, she promises that they will not break the agreement and accepts the condition. The patriarch then asks whether she will personally lead the Venom clan's exploration team. Marissa confirms that she will. He says he looks forward to seeing the famed strength of the 10,000 Venom. Marissa gives him a formal farewell and says they will await the Dark Magic clan's team on the day of the expedition. After she leaves, the patriarch remains silent for several seconds before standing and staring at a chessboard. He picks up the Black King and knocks over the White Queen. As the Black King remains standing, he remarks that a beautiful stage filled with screams has been prepared for Marissa. 2 months pass, and the seasons change. While Chris dedicates himself to training, others begin changing their own paths. Some struggle with love they have lost, others fall behind after losing competitions, the jealous sharpen their blades, and several begin preparing for the future. Meanwhile, a mysterious figure remains hidden. Chris eventually faces the acting head again. The man orders him to prove his worth. Chris takes the opportunity to summon his dark blade. His older brother's expression immediately darkens. Chris notices their reactions and finds them amusing. Meanwhile, the clan head has previously warned him not to reveal the true black sword. Doing so could cause them to assign him an even harder trial simply because they now know how talented he is. Following that advice, Chris deliberately holds back. He is already looking forward to seeing their expressions when they eventually discover the truth. The acting head acknowledges Chris's achievements and assigns him the second trial. The clan will soon send an exploration team to search for the relic that appeared in the neutral zone. Since the Venom clan will also participate, the acting head says that if Chris earns enough merit during the expedition, he will recognize him as a successor candidate. Chris finds the offer suspiciously easy and asks whether he will be participating alone. He learns that he will join the unit led by the second princess, Jupion. The acting head explains that this mission originally belonged to Roy. He treats it as an opportunity far beyond Chris's current position and tells him to consider it an honor. Chris accepts the order without protest. After he leaves, his brother asks their father whether he is worried that Chris will earn even more merit. The acting head stops him and tells him not to worry because everything is proceeding according to plan. He simply needs to be ready when the right moment comes. Outside, Chris thinks that he expected to be sent on a life-threatening mission, yet something about this assignment feels wrong. He remembers what he knows about the original timeline. The successor candidate at this point was never supposed to be Christian, it was Roy. But Chris never heard anything about Roy during the Great War. Later, Chris is forced to listen while the Foxwoman explains the Demon Amulet incident, a relic conflict between the Dark Magic clan and the Venom clan that was never widely known outside the two families. Although the Dark Magic clan's entire expedition team was wiped out, the Venom clan also suffered losses. For some reason, both sides concealed what happened. According to her, the incident became one of the seeds of the coming disaster. Nordion eventually dies at the hands of Marquis Ranum. Without that event, the bloodletting Demon King would not have conquered the Dark Magic clan so easily. The Demon Amulet incident therefore accelerated the Age of Destruction. Since the Dark Magic clan's expedition team was annihilated, Roy's position in the original timeline has effectively been replaced by Chris. However, without solid evidence, acting prematurely would be too dangerous. Chris is still only a 3-star fiend and cannot change much yet. For now, the best option is to prepare. As he gets ready to leave, Jupion stops him and asks where he thinks he is going. Chris questions why she cares. She explains that she heard he is joining the exploration team and says she dislikes the idea, but he will be filling in for Roy. Chris says he will not have to do anything immediately. Jupion takes this as another insult toward her brother and says that an idiot like him would probably accomplish nothing anyway. Hearing her insult her brother, Jupion suddenly throws a dagger at him. Chris clearly sees the movement and calmly dodges it without flinching. Jupion is shocked by how effortlessly he followed the dagger's trajectory. Chris considers that enough of a greeting and tells her that since they clearly cannot stand each other, they should simply stay out of one another's way. Before she can respond, he leaves, saying he has other matters to attend to. Jupion retrieves her dagger, visibly irritated. Chris not only followed its movement with his eyes, but deliberately waited until the last moment to dodge. She realizes he knew exactly what she was trying to do, and begins to suspect that he may be far more dangerous than she expected. With nothing else to do, Chris wanders through the city. He grabs a beer and tries to drink it, only for the innkeeper to pull it away because he is underage. He then heads to a gambling table and wins a considerable amount of money. Afterward, he runs around with several sticks of meat, eating freely while the child beside him looks depressed by the sight. Chris enjoys finally having a break and thinks he could happily spend his time doing nothing. While continuing to eat, he searches for a particular shop, but realizes he needs to deal with the people following him first. He suspects they were sent by the acting head. Suddenly, a mysterious figure grabs him and tells him to stay quiet. Chris looks over and finds a beautiful girl. He asks who she is, but instead of answering, she explains that someone was following her and that her people already dealt with them. Chris finds that difficult to believe, considering she has already gagged him and dragged him away.